The airfield was alive with a constant hum. Engines roared, tools clattered, and the wind carried the sharp, acrid scent of oil and metal. It was 1920, and the airmen at RAF Scampton, a remote airbase in the English countryside, were used to the chaotic rhythm of their days. Planes would land and take off at all hours, and between the mechanical whine of engines, the men worked tirelessly to keep them in the air. It was a place that thrived on precision, but beneath that facade of order, there was chaos within the machines and the men who kept them running. Freddie Jackson was a part of this world. He was one of the many mechanics who worked long hours ensuring the safety of the aircraft. Unlike some of his colleagues, who found solace in the repetitive grind of fixing engines, Freddie was restless. His hands were steady, but his mind rarely was. He had a quick smile and a laugh that could brighten the darkest mood, but there were days when the shadows crept into his eyes, as if a storm was brewing just beneath the surface. Freddie had always been a bit of a daredevil. Even before he joined the Air Force, he had a reputation for taking risks, sometimes unnecessary ones. He would drink more than he should, stay up long past the point of exhaustion, and push himself beyond his limits. His friends saw it as part of his charm, a kind of reckless bravery that suited a man working in such a dangerous environment. But there was more to it than that. Freddie was running from something, though no one quite knew what. Maybe he didn't know either. In the mess hall, Freddie was a popular figure. He could tell a joke that would have the entire room in stitches, and his easygoing nature meant he had friends in every corner of the base. But when the laughter died down and the long nights settled over the airfield, Freddie would find himself alone, staring at the bottom of a bottle or out into the dark sky, searching for something he couldn't quite name. His comrades never thought much of it. They were all a little rough around the edges, after all. The war had taken its toll on each of them, and everyone had their own way of coping. For some, it was gambling. For others, it was the numbing comfort of drink or the reckless thrill of dangerous stunts. Freddie's self-destructive streak was no secret, but he was good at what he did. No one doubted his skill as a mechanic. He could coax life back into engines that seemed beyond repair, and he had an uncanny knack for knowing when something was wrong just by the sound of a plane's hum. But there were days when Freddie's eyes were red-rimmed, and his hands shook ever so slightly, and his friends would look the other way, pretending not to notice. It was easier that way. "Hey, Freddie, you think you can fix this mess before we have to put it back up there?" called out James, a fellow mechanic, slapping the wing of a biplane that had seen better days. Freddie glanced up from his work, a smirk tugging at his lips. "Course I can," he said, wiping his hands on a rag. "Just keep your hands off it, and we'll be fine." There was laughter, but it was forced, like they were trying to chase away the tension that hung over the airfield like a storm cloud. The airmen lived for these moments of camaraderie. They were a tight-knit group, bound by the shared knowledge that any day could be their last. The aircraft they serviced weren't just machines. They were lifelines, the difference between making it home and not. But the constant pressure wore on them. There were days when Freddie could see it in their eyes, the way they all carried themselves a little more heavily, like they were trudging through an invisible fog. Freddie knew that feeling well. It was there every morning, in the split second after he woke up, but before he remembered where he was. It was a hollow ache that gnawed at him, a feeling that no amount of liquor or laughter could quite chase away. Sometimes he would climb up onto the wing of a plane and just sit there, watching the horizon as the sun dipped below the clouds, the sky painted in shades of gold and crimson. It was beautiful, but it also felt like an end, a reminder that everything, even the brightest day, would fade into darkness. One evening, after a long shift, Freddie sat with a few of the guys in the mess hall, nursing a drink. It had been a rough day, with more than one near miss and a lot of frayed nerves. Freddie's laugh was a little louder than usual. his jokes a little sharper, like he was trying to drown out something that only he could hear. "You're gonna drink yourself into an early grave, mate," said Tom, one of the pilots, with a half smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Freddie just shrugged, tipping his glass back and letting the warmth slide down his throat. "Better than going slow," he said, and there was a moment of silence, heavy and uncomfortable, before someone changed the subject. They all knew what he meant. No one wanted to talk about it, but it was there, unspoken. The understanding that they were all just trying to keep themselves together until the next day. As the night wore on, Freddie slipped out, leaving the noise behind. He wandered the airfield, hands shoved into his pockets, the cold air biting at his skin. He paused by one of the planes, running his fingers along the smooth metal, his breath misting in the dark. He felt a strange kinship with the aircraft, both of them patched up and pushed to their limits, holding together by sheer force of will. Freddie didn't know why he did half the things he did. Maybe it was because he felt like he was always on borrowed time, like there was something chasing him, and if he stopped moving, it would catch up. He wanted to be brave, but there were nights when he was just tired, and all he could do was stand there, staring out at the empty airstrip, feeling like he was standing on the edge of something he couldn't see. And so the days passed. The engines roared, the planes flew, and Freddie kept going, one foot in front of the other, holding on to the things that made sense to him. But even then, he could feel it, the cracks starting to show. The way his hands would tremble when he thought no one was looking. The way he would flinch at the sound of a distant explosion, as if the war was still there, lurking in the shadows. In the end, they were all just trying to survive in their own ways. And maybe that was why no one said anything when Freddie took one more drink or stayed out on the airfield a little too long, staring into the dark. They all understood, even if they didn't have the words to say it. The morning of the accident started like any other at the airfield. The sun was barely peeking over the horizon, and the ground was still wet with dew as the airmen went about their routines. Engines revved, pilots prepared their flight plans, and the mechanics, including Freddie Jackson, worked to ensure every aircraft was ready to take to the skies. It was a regular day, one that would end up far from ordinary. Freddie hadn't slept much the night before. He had stayed up, drinking and joking with a few friends, trying to shake off the restlessness that had been clinging to him for weeks. When he finally stumbled into bed, he could barely close his eyes without the room spinning around him. He was groggy and irritable, his hands shaky, but he still showed up to work. He always did. The airfield was bustling by the time Freddie arrived. He dragged a hand through his hair, trying to clear his head, and headed to his station. There were planes lined up for routine checks, and he was assigned to inspect one of the newer biplanes. It was a task he could do in his sleep, and most days, it felt like he did. "Morning, Freddie. You look like hell," James greeted, giving him a pat on the back. James's tone was light, but there was concern in his eyes. It wasn't the first time he'd seen Freddie looking worn out. Lately, it seemed like there were more bad days than good ones. Freddie grinned, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Yeah, well, it's my natural state," he joked, picking up his tools and getting to work. "Just keep your eyes on those gauges, and we'll be fine." The morning passed in a blur of noise and motion. Freddie moved from plane to plane, tightening bolts, checking fuel lines, and making small adjustments. His hands worked on autopilot, but his mind felt like it was floating somewhere just out of reach. He knew the routine so well that he could almost do it without thinking, but today, there was a creeping sense of unease he couldn't shake. It was around midday when things took a turn. One of the pilots, a young man named Arthur, was preparing for a test flight. The plane had just been serviced, and it was supposed to be a quick routine check. Freddie had been one of the last to work on it, and he had given it the all clear. As Arthur climbed into the cockpit, Freddy caught sight of him and gave a thumbs up, a casual sign of reassurance. But his smile faded as soon as the plane began to taxi down the runway. The engine stuttered, coughed, and then roared to life. For a moment, everything seemed fine. But then, without warning, the plane veered to one side, the nose dipping dangerously. Freddy's heart skipped a beat, and he felt a cold, creeping dread wash over him as he watched. He knew something was wrong, but he couldn't understand what. Arthur tried to correct the plane, but it was too late. The biplane jerked and twisted, the wings catching the ground as it skidded, flipping over in a sickening slow-motion roll. The sound of metal crunching and the deafening roar of the crash echoed across the airfield. Freddy felt frozen, his feet rooted to the spot as he watched the disaster unfold in front of him. Shouts filled the air, and people started running toward the wreckage. Freddy was one of the first to move, sprinting across the field, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might burst. He could smell the smoke, sharp and acrid, burning the back of his throat. He didn't care. He just had to get there, had to do something. When he reached the plane, it was already clear that it was bad. The cockpit was a mangled mess of metal and shattered glass, and Arthur was slumped over, unmoving. Freddy's hand shook as he tried to pull the twisted frame apart, desperate to reach him. "Come on, Arthur, stay with me," he muttered under his breath, his voice choked with panic. But there was nothing he could do. The medics arrived within minutes, pulling Freddy away as they worked to free Arthur. Freddy stood there, helpless, his clothes smeared with oil and dirt, his hands trembling. He watched as they lifted Arthur's limp body out of the wreckage, his face pale, his uniform stained with blood. There was no need to say it out loud. The silence that followed spoke volumes. The rest of the day passed in a haze. The airfield, normally so full of life, felt hollow, as if the crash had sucked all the air out of it. The men gathered in small, quiet groups, whispering and glancing over at the twisted wreckage, still lying on the runway like a dark stain. Freddy stayed close to the hangar, away from the others. He didn't want to hear the whispers or see the pity in their eyes. He kept replaying the morning over and over in his head, trying to figure out what had gone wrong. Had he missed something? Was there a mistake he didn't catch? The questions gnawed at him, relentless and cruel. He was a good mechanic. He prided himself on that. But now, all he could think about was the look on Arthur's face, the way he had smiled just before he climbed into the cockpit. "Freddy, it's not your fault," James said quietly, coming up beside him. "These things happen. Sometimes it's just bad luck." Freddy clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms. "No," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "I should have known. I should have seen it." He didn't know what he was supposed to have seen, but it didn't matter. The guilt was like a weight, crushing his chest, making it hard to breathe. That night, Freddy found himself alone again, but this time, the silence felt unbearable. He didn't go to the mess hall. He couldn't face the others, couldn't bear to see their faces, knowing they were thinking about the same thing he was. Instead, he wandered out to the edge of the airfield, a bottle in hand, the cold night air biting at his skin. He drank and drank, but the numbness he was searching for never quite came. Every time he closed his eyes, he could see the crash, hear the screech of metal, and the shouts echoing in his ears. The bottle slipped from his grasp, shattering on the ground, and he sank to his knees, his hands shaking so badly he could barely keep them still. There was no way to escape it. The guilt, the fear, the sickening feeling that he had let everyone down, it all swirled around him, closing in like a vice. He wanted to scream, but no sound came out, just a strangled gasp that got lost in the wind. He didn't know how long he stayed there, crumpled on the ground, but when he finally looked up, the sky was dark, the stars glinting coldly above him. For the first time, Freddy realized he was afraid, not just of what had happened, but of what might happen next. He had always prided himself on being able to handle anything, but now he felt like he was standing on the edge of a cliff, staring down into a void that he couldn't pull himself back from. The next morning, Freddy showed up to work, but it was like he was moving through a fog. The airfield seemed quieter than usual, the men subdued, their faces drawn and tired. There was no laughter, no easy banter, just the grim, heavy silence that followed in the wake of tragedy. And for Freddy, that silence was worse than anything else, because in that silence, there was nowhere to hide from the truth. Something had broken, and he didn't know how to fix it. The weeks after the crash were a blur. The airfield, usually bustling with noise and life, had settled into a somber rhythm. The men went about their duties with a sense of quiet determination, avoiding eye contact and speaking in hushed tones. The wreckage had long been cleared, but the memory of what happened still lingered like a dark cloud over the base. Freddie Jackson was still there, but he wasn't really there. He moved through his days mechanically, his mind somewhere else, his eyes haunted. Everyone at the airfield knew that Freddie had taken Arthur's death hard. Most of them had lost friends before. It was part of the job, but this was different. Freddie hadn't just lost a friend. He felt like he had failed one. And no matter how many times people tried to tell him it wasn't his fault, he couldn't shake the feeling that he should have done something, seen something, that would have changed everything. Freddie's nights became a series of long, solitary walks around the airfield, usually with a bottle hidden in his jacket. He would sit on the wing of an old plane, staring out into the darkness, letting the cold seep into his skin until he felt numb. The alcohol helped dull the edges of his thoughts, but it never silenced them completely. He was spiraling, and he knew it, but he couldn't figure out how to stop. The emptiness was always there, gnawing at him, no matter how hard he tried to fill it. It was on one of those nights that James approached him. Freddie hadn't seen him coming, and when James sat down beside him on the wing, Freddie nearly dropped his bottle. "You're gonna catch your death out here," James said, his voice gentle but firm. He didn't look at Freddie, just stared out into the dark, his hands shoved into his pockets. "You don't have to do this alone, you know." Freddie laughed, but it was a hollow, brittle sound. "What am I supposed to do then? Pretend everything's fine?" "Because it's not." James didn't respond right away. They sat in silence for a while, the only sound the distant hum of a generator and the occasional rustle of wind. Finally, James spoke, his voice barely more than a whisper. "We're taking a group photo tomorrow. For the squadron. Thought you might want to be there." Freddie hesitated. It felt wrong. The idea of standing in front of a camera, smiling, as if everything was back to normal. But there was something in James's tone, a quiet insistence, that made it hard to saying no. "I'll think about it," he said, which was the closest he could come to agreeing. The next day dawned gray and overcast, the sky heavy with clouds that threatened rain. The mood around the airfield was subdued, as if the weather had seeped into everyone's bones. When Freddie showed up at the hangar, he was surprised to see how many of the men were already there, dressed in their uniforms, trying to smooth out their jackets and straighten their caps. For a moment, it felt like things were almost normal again, like they were just a group of friends getting ready to have their picture taken, rather than a team struggling to hold themselves together. The photographer, an older man with a thick mustache and a gruff manner, barked orders at the men, directing them into place. "Stand straight, look sharp. We're not here to waste time," he said, snapping his fingers at anyone who moved too slowly. Freddie found himself near the back, squeezed between James and another mechanic named Tom. He felt out of place, like he was watching the whole thing from a distance. "Smile, Freddie," James said, nudging him with his elbow. "It won't kill you." Freddie forced a grin, though it felt more like a grimace. The photographer raised his camera, and for a moment, everything seemed to stand still. Then there was a flash, a click, and it was over. The men broke apart, talking and laughing as they headed back to their duties, the moment already fading from memory. Freddie lingered, watching them go, feeling an odd sense of disconnection. He hadn't realized how much he missed that sound, the easy banter, the jokes. It made him ache because it reminded him of how things used to be before everything went wrong. A few days later, the photograph arrived. The photographer had developed it quickly, and a small group gathered around to take a look. It was a decent shot, considering the conditions. The men were standing in neat rows, their uniforms crisp, their faces solemn but not without a hint of a smile. James spotted Freddie and waved him over. "Here it is," James said, holding up the photograph. "We don't look half bad, do we?" Freddie took the picture, glancing over it without much interest. But as his eyes scanned the rows of faces, he felt his heart stop. There, standing at the edge of the group, almost hidden in the shadow of the hangar, was a face he recognized all too well. It was Arthur. Freddie blinked, convinced he was imagining things. He looked again, harder this time, but the face didn't disappear. It was Arthur, staring straight at the camera, his expression calm and steady, as if he had never been gone at all. The room was suddenly too bright, the air too thin. Freddie stumbled back, nearly dropping the photograph. "No," he whispered, his voice cracking. That's impossible." "What's impossible?" James asked, frowning. "Freddie, what's wrong?" Freddie shoved the photograph into James's hands, his fingers shaking. "Look," he said, his voice barely more than a rasp. "Tell me you see it too." James studied the picture, his brow furrowing. For a long moment, he said nothing, and Freddie thought he was going to dismiss it, tell him he was imagining things. But then James's eyes widened, and he looked up, his face pale. "How?" He started, but he didn't finish the question. He didn't have to. They both knew what he was seeing. Word spread quickly across the airfield. Men who hadn't been interested in the photograph before were suddenly clamoring to see it, passing it around with a mix of awe and unease. Some tried to laugh it off, calling it a trick of the light, a flaw in the film. But others weren't so sure. They had known Arthur, had seen him smiling and joking just like everyone else. They had mourned him. And now, there he was, staring back at them from a photograph that shouldn't have been able to capture him. Freddie felt like he was losing his grip on reality. He had been struggling to hold himself together ever since the crash, but this was too much. He wanted to believe it was just a mistake, that there was some logical explanation. But every time he looked at the photograph, he felt a chill run down his spine, as if someone was walking over his grave. "It doesn't make sense," he muttered, mostly to himself. "He's gone. I saw it. We all did." James placed a hand on his shoulder, his expression grim. "Maybe he's trying to tell us something." The words sent a shiver through Freddie. "Tell us what?" he asked, but James just shook his head. He didn't have an answer, and neither did anyone else. The photograph was a mystery, one that none of them could explain. It felt like a message, but no one knew what it was supposed to mean. In the days that followed, the atmosphere at the airfield grew tense. The photograph was pinned up in the mess hall, where anyone could see it, and every time Freddie walked past, he felt a knot tighten in his chest. The men started to whisper, not just about the photograph, but about the strange things that had been happening since the crash, the tools that went missing, only to turn up in odd places, the flicker of shadows where there shouldn't have been any, the feeling that they were being watched. Freddie didn't want to believe in ghosts. But late at night, when he was alone and the air was still, he could feel something pressing in around him, heavy and suffocating. He thought about Arthur, about the way he had looked in the photograph, and he wondered if maybe James was right. Maybe Arthur was trying to tell them something. Or maybe, Freddie thought, his mind darkening, it was something worse. Maybe it was a warning. The airfield was no longer the familiar, bustling place it had once been. Since the photograph appeared, a suffocating tension seemed to hang in the air, thick and heavy, making it hard for the men to go about their routines. Conversations that used to be filled with laughter had turned quiet, filled with nervous glances and uneasy murmurs. No one spoke about the photograph outright, but it was on everyone's mind. Freddie could see it in their faces, in the way they moved, cautious and alert, as if expecting something to happen at any moment. Freddie himself was barely holding it together. He had stopped trying to convince himself that everything was fine, because it clearly wasn't. Every day felt like he was walking through a nightmare, one he couldn't wake up from. And every time he saw Arthur's face in that photograph, he felt a chill seep into his bones. It wasn't just the image of his dead friend that haunted him. It was the feeling that Arthur was still there, somewhere, watching. The strange occurrences that had begun after the crash were becoming harder to ignore. At first, it had been small things. The misplaced tools, the flickering lights, the occasional murmur of voices when no one else was around. But as the days passed, the incidents grew more unsettling. One evening, Freddie was working late in the hangar, trying to lose himself in the monotony of fixing an engine. The hangar was quiet. The only sounds the soft clink of metal and the hum of machinery. But then he heard a faint whisper, just behind his ear. He spun around, expecting to see someone standing there, but there was no one. Just the empty, dimly lit hangar, shadows stretching across the floor. He told himself he was imagining things, that he was just tired. But then it happened again, a low, indistinct murmur, like someone speaking just out of earshot. This time, he didn't turn around. He just closed his eyes and tried to focus on his breathing, willing the whisper to stop. But it didn't. Instead, it grew louder, more insistent, until he could almost make out words. His hands began to shake, and he dropped his wrench, the clatter echoing through the empty space. He wanted to run, but his feet felt glued to the spot. It wasn't until he heard a loud bang, like something falling, that he finally snapped out of it and bolted for the door, his heart pounding. Outside, the cool night air hit his face, sharp and biting, and he took a deep, shaky breath. He stood there for a moment, trying to steady himself before looking back at the hangar. Nothing seemed out of place, but he could still feel the whispering, like it was lingering just out of reach. He didn't go back inside. Instead, he headed straight for his bunk, where he lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, his mind racing. The next morning, Freddie didn't mention what had happened. He didn't want to talk about it, didn't want to admit that he was starting to crack. But when he showed up for roll call, he could see that he wasn't the only one on edge. James, who was usually so upbeat, looked exhausted, dark circles under his eyes. Tom, another mechanic, was fidgeting with his hands, his gaze darting around nervously. It was as if the whole squadron was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. That day, they had a maintenance check on one of the old biplanes. It was a simple task, one they had done hundreds of times before. But as Freddie climbed into the cockpit to check the controls, he felt a jolt of unease. The seat was cold, colder than it should have been, and for a moment, he felt like he was sitting in someone else's place. He brushed it off, telling himself it was just his mind playing tricks on him. But when he reached for the throttle, his hand froze. There, etched faintly into the metal, were the initials, a J. Freddie's breath caught in his throat. Arthur Jameson. Arthur's initials. He stared at them, unblinking, his mind struggling to make sense of it. The letters were faint, almost worn away, like they had been there for years. But he knew they hadn't been. He would have seen them before. Freddie jumped out of the cockpit, his hands clammy, and rushed to find James. When he found him, he didn't even bother with a greeting. "You need to see this," he said, his voice tight with urgency. James followed him back to the plane, his expression puzzled. But when he saw the initials, His confusion turned to alarm. "Do you think?" James began, but he didn't finish the question. He didn't have to. They both knew what he was asking. Freddy didn't answer. He didn't know what to say. All he could think about was the photograph, the whispering, and now this. It felt like the air around them was closing in, suffocating. He wanted to believe there was a rational explanation, that someone was playing a cruel joke. But deep down, he was beginning to suspect the truth was far more terrifying. The rumors spread fast. By the end of the day, everyone on the base had heard about the initials. Some of the men tried to laugh it off, saying it was just a coincidence, but their laughter sounded forced, hollow. Others started avoiding the hangar altogether, as if they could feel the same creeping unease that Freddy did. And then there were those who began to whisper, not just about Arthur, but about ghosts. Freddy hated that word. It made everything feel more real, more impossible to ignore. But the signs were everywhere, and they were getting harder to dismiss. One night, he was lying in his bunk, staring at the photograph that someone had left on his bedside table. He didn't know who had put it there, and he didn't want to know. He was about to turn off the light when he heard a sound, soft and rhythmic like footsteps. He sat up, his heart thudding in his chest, and listened. The footsteps were faint, almost like someone walking on tiptoe. They moved down the hallway, slow and deliberate, stopping right outside his door. Freddy held his breath, waiting for them to move on, but they didn't. They just stood there, silent, like they were waiting for him to do something. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice trembling. There was no answer, but he could feel a presence, heavy and cold, pressing against the door. He stayed like that for what felt like hours, his eyes fixed on the handle, half expecting it to turn. But it never did. Eventually, the footsteps moved away, fading into the distance, leaving him alone in the dark. Freddy didn't sleep that night. The next morning, he found James and told him everything, the whispers, the initials, the footsteps. He expected James to tell him he was overreacting, that he needed to get some rest. But instead, James just nodded, his expression grim. "You're not the only one, Freddy," he said quietly. "Others have been hearing things too, seeing things." It was the confirmation Freddy had been dreading. He had been hoping, even praying, that it was all in his head, that he was just losing it. But if other people were experiencing the same thing, then it was real. And if it was real, then there was no escaping it. The whispers grew louder, the shadows darker. More men began reporting strange occurrences, doors that creaked open on their own, tools that vanished without a trace, voices that seemed to come from nowhere. Some of them even claimed to have seen Arthur, standing at the edge of the airfield, watching them. Freddy wanted to tell them they were imagining things, but he couldn't bring himself to say it, because he had seen it too. One night, after another restless, sleepless evening, Freddy found himself back in the hangar, staring at the photograph pinned to the wall. He didn't know why he kept coming back to it, why he couldn't just let it go. Maybe he was looking for answers, or maybe he was just waiting for something to change. But as he stood there, staring at Arthur's face, he felt a strange sense of calm, as if everything was finally starting to make sense. Maybe Arthur was trying to reach out, to say something that he hadn't been able to say before. Or maybe he was stuck, trapped between this world and the next, unable to move on. Freddy didn't know, but he could feel the pull, the invisible thread that connected them, and he knew it was only a matter of time before something gave. As he turned to leave, he heard a whisper, soft and clear, cutting through the stillness of the hangar. "Freddy." It was Arthur's voice, unmistakable, and it sent a shiver down his spine. He didn't turn around. He just stood there, frozen, as the voice whispered again, more insistent this time. "Freddy, help me." For the first time in weeks, Freddy felt a glimmer of hope. If Arthur was trying to communicate, then maybe he could figure out what he wanted. Maybe he could help him find peace. But even as he clung to that hope, a part of him knew that whatever was happening was far from over. It was just beginning, and he was standing right at the center of it. The airfield had become a place of restless, unspoken fears. The men moved like ghosts themselves, avoiding the hangar, the photograph, and, most of all, Freddie. They could sense something different about him, something heavy and unsettling, like he was carrying a burden they couldn't see. He was still showing up for work, still going through the motions, but there was a hollowness in his eyes that hadn't been there before, a kind of quiet desperation that set him apart from the others. Freddie had spent sleepless nights trying to piece together what was happening. The whispers, the initials on the plane, the footsteps, each event felt like part of a larger puzzle, but no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't see the full picture. He knew Arthur was trying to communicate with him. He could feel it, a presence that lingered just at the edge of his consciousness, pulling him closer, urging him to listen. But the more he tried to understand, the more confused he became. The base was no longer just a workplace. It was a labyrinth of shadows and echoes, and Freddie felt like he was lost somewhere in the middle, unable to find his way out. Every night, he would return to the hangar, staring at the photograph, waiting for the whispers to come. He didn't know what he was expecting, maybe another message, maybe a sign. But each time he heard Arthur's voice, it was the same, repeating that same plea. Help me. As the days went on, the strange occurrences only escalated. The whispers became more frequent, no longer confined to the quiet of the night. Men began reporting cold spots, sudden drafts of icy air that seemed to come out of nowhere, sending shivers down their spines even in the middle of summer. Tools would disappear, only to reappear in places they had no reason to be, like the mess hall or the barracks. And then there were the sightings' fleeting glimpses of a figure, standing just at the edge of the runway, barely visible in the fading light. Freddie wasn't the only one who saw him. Others had started to see Arthur, too, and the stories spread quickly, each one more unnerving than the last. Some said they had seen him standing by the hangar, his uniform neat, his face calm, like he was waiting for something. Others claimed to have seen him in the barracks, sitting on an empty bunk, staring at the wall. But every account had one thing in common, the look in Arthur's eyes. A look of sadness, of longing, as if he was searching for something he couldn't find. James was the first to confront Freddie about it. One evening, after another long, grueling day, he found Freddie in the hangar, staring at the photograph, the same way he had been every night for weeks. James approached him cautiously, as if afraid that speaking too loudly might shatter whatever fragile hold Freddie had on reality. "Freddie," James said, his voice soft but firm, "you need to stop this. Whatever's happening, it's not your fault. You can't keep torturing yourself like this." Freddie didn't look at him. "You don't understand," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Arthur is trying to tell me something. He needs my help." James sighed, running a hand through his hair. "You're not making sense. Arthur's gone, Freddie. Whatever you think you're hearing, it's not real. You need to let it go." Freddie turned to face him, and for a moment, James recoiled at the intensity in his eyes. "You think I want to believe this?" Freddie snapped, his voice cracking with frustration. "You think I want to spend every night listening to whispers in the dark, wondering if I'm losing my mind. But I'm telling you, it's real. I've heard him. I've seen him." James hesitated, torn between wanting to comfort his friend and the fear that there was nothing he could say to make things better. "Even if it is real, what are you going to do?" he asked quietly. "You can't bring him back." Freddie didn't answer. He just looked back at the photograph, his eyes distant, lost. "I don't know," he said finally, "but I have to try. I can't keep living like this." That night, Freddie made up his mind. He didn't know how, but he was going to find a way to reach Arthur, to figure out what he was trying to say. He couldn't keep running from it. couldn't keep pretending that everything was normal. Because it wasn't, and it never would be until he found a way to understand what was happening. He waited until the base had quieted down, until most of the men had gone to bed. Then he slipped out of his bunk, making his way to the hangar with a flashlight in hand. The air was cool and the sky was clear, a sharp contrast to the darkness that seemed to have settled over the airfield. As he approached the hangar, he could feel his heart begin to race, his pulse pounding in his ears, but he didn't stop. He had come this far, and he wasn't going to turn back now. Inside, the hangar was dark and silent, the only light coming from the faint glow of his flashlight. He made his way to the old biplane, the one with Arthur's initials, and climbed into the cockpit. He didn't know what he was expecting to find, but as he sat there, surrounded by the familiar smell of oil and metal, he felt a strange sense of calm wash over him, as if he was exactly where he was supposed to be. "Arthur," he whispered, his voice echoing in the stillness. "If you're here, if you can hear me, I'm listening." For a long moment, there was nothing but silence. And then, slowly, the air around him began to change. It was subtle at first, a faint chill that prickled his skin, but it grew stronger, sharper, until it felt like he was standing in the middle of a freezing wind. And then he heard it a whisper, so soft he almost missed it, but unmistakable. "Freddy." He turned, his flashlight sweeping across the hangar, but there was no one there. "I'm here, Arthur," he said, louder this time, his voice steady even though his hands were shaking. "What do you want me to do?" The whisper came again, clearer this time, and Freddy felt a shiver run down his spine. "I need you to remember." "Remember what?" Freddy asked, his voice rising with frustration. "I don't understand." "Please, just tell me." The hangar seemed to grow darker, the shadows deepening, and for a moment, Freddy thought he saw something move out of the corner of his eye, a figure, standing just at the edge of the light. He swung the flashlight around, and there, barely visible in the darkness, was Arthur. He looked exactly as he had in life, his uniform crisp, his cap tilted at a slight angle, his face calm. But there was something different about him now, something sad and distant, as if he was struggling to hold on to whatever was keeping him there. Freddy felt his throat tighten. "Arthur," he whispered. "What happened? Why are you still here?" Arthur didn't answer right away. He just looked at Freddy, his eyes filled with an emotion that was impossible to read. And then, slowly, he raised his hand, pointing to the biplane, to the initials etched into the metal. "Remember," he said, his voice barely more than a sigh, "it wasn't your fault." Freddy blinked, confused. "What do you mean?" "I don't." Before he could finish, the hangar was filled with a loud, echoing bang, like the sound of an engine misfiring. Freddy flinched, his flashlight slipping from his grasp and clattering to the floor. When he looked up, Arthur was gone, the darkness swallowing him whole. Freddy stumbled out of the cockpit, his hands trembling, his mind reeling. It wasn't his fault. That's what Arthur had said. But he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to it, something he was missing, something Arthur was trying to show him. And as he stood there, alone in the dark, he realized he couldn't do this by himself. He needed help. The next morning, Freddy went to James. He told him everything, from the whispers to the sighting in the hangar, and for the first time, James didn't try to dismiss it. He listened, his expression serious, and when Freddy was done, he nodded. "If Arthur's trying to reach out, then maybe we need to find a way to reach back," James said. "But we're not going to do it alone. Whatever's happening, we're going to face it together." It was the first time in weeks that Freddy felt a flicker of hope. He didn't know what lay ahead, or if they would ever get the answers they were looking for. But at least now, he wasn't alone. And as they stood there, staring at the photograph pinned to the wall, he couldn't help but feel that maybe, just maybe, they were finally getting closer to the truth. Whatever had kept Arthur tethered to this place, whatever message he was trying to deliver, Freddie was determined to uncover it. And this time, he wasn't going to run. On a muggy Saturday night, June 7th, 1986, 29-year-old Kathy Lipscomb parked her car in front of a modest apartment complex in San Antonio, Texas. As she reached into her purse to retrieve a tube of lipstick, she tilted the rearview mirror toward her face and studied her reflection. Her platinum bangs swept to the side of her forehead, and she noticed a glow that had not been there in a long time. It was a glimmer of something that had once been part of her life when she was a newlywed, before the years took their toll. Kathy's marriage had become a prison she was desperate to escape. 8 years and 2 children later, she had grown increasingly restless, feeling caged by the expectations and routines that had come to define her daily life. But that restlessness had taken on a new tone about a month ago, when she and her husband, Bill, had agreed to separate. The decision had been a difficult one, yet it offered her a taste of freedom she had craved. Now, for the first time in years, she felt like she was becoming herself again, a version of herself she had nearly forgotten existed. She stepped out of the car, clutching her purse close as she headed toward the building. The large apartment complex loomed ahead, casting shadows over the poorly lit parking lot. As she climbed the steps, Kathy could feel butterflies fluttering in her stomach, not the kind of nervousness that came with fear, but the kind that signaled anticipation, a thrill. She was heading to spend the night with her new boyfriend, a man she had fallen completely in love with. It was as if this relationship had breathed new life into her, rekindling a long-lost excitement. Bill, her soon-to-be ex-husband, had the kids for the weekend, giving Kathy a rare opportunity to let go of her worries and immerse herself in the present moment. She reached the 3rd floor and rang the doorbell of her boyfriend's apartment, a faint smile pulling at her lips as she listened to the sound of approaching footsteps. When the door opened, she stepped inside, her heart leaping as she was greeted by his warm embrace. The door closed behind them, sealing her away from the problems that had plagued her, if only for a little while. The next evening, Bill, a 30-year-old Air Force Master Sergeant, was driving the children to Kathy's new apartment on the other side of town. Kathy was supposed to pick them up from Bill's place, but she hadn't shown up, nor had she called. That was unusual for her. Kathy never neglected her responsibilities when it came to the kids, so when she didn't answer her phone either, Bill grew uneasy. It was almost 7 p.m. when they arrived at her building, and as Bill knocked on the door of Kathy's unit, a ground-floor apartment, there was only silence in response. He tried knocking again, and again there was no answer. The kids stood next to him, looking up with curious, innocent faces, and Bill did his best to mask his concern. He didn't want to frighten them. Instead, he took a deep breath and told them to stay by the door while he went to get a notepad and pen from the car. He jotted down a quick note explaining that they had been there at 6:45 and would try again later, then taped it to the door. His daughter insisted on adding her own message. "Mommy, we love you," written in the blocky, uneven letters of a child. Bill smiled and stuck the note beside his own before turning back to the car with the children in tow. But as he drove away, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Kathy was known for her reliability, her steadfast commitment to routine. She was not the type to just vanish. Yet, here she was, unreachable and absent from the place she now called home. The uneasy feeling gnawed at him, growing stronger as the hours slipped by. The next morning, at 9 a.m. On Monday, Sarah Bowers, a colleague of Kathy's at the University Health Clinic, was walking briskly down the hallway to Kathy's office. Sarah needed to discuss an urgent matter with Kathy, but as she entered the room, she was met with emptiness. The "while you were out" memos had piled up on Kathy's desk, little pink slips stacking one on top of the other. Sarah glanced at them, her curiosity morphing into concern as she picked one up. It was from Bill, who had called an hour earlier looking for Kathy. Sarah's gut twisted. Kathy was not only a reliable nurse, but also her friend. She never missed work without giving a reason, and she always answered her phone. Sarah grabbed the phone on Kathy's desk and dialed Kathy's apartment number from memory. It rang and rang, but there was no answer. An unsettling anxiety settled over Sarah, and she found herself repeatedly glancing at the clock, each tick a reminder that something was off. By 10 a.m. Sarah could no longer stand it. She marched to their supervisor's office, her face tense with worry. Dr. David Pearl, their boss, looked up from his paperwork, his brow furrowing as Sarah explained Kathy's unexplained absence and Bill's unanswered calls. Dr. Pearl, although initially calm, began to share Sarah's concern. He agreed that something might be wrong and asked Sarah to drive over to Kathy's apartment to check on her. When Sarah arrived, she saw the notes Bill had taped to the door the previous evening, fluttering slightly in the morning breeze. She knocked on the door, calling out Kathy's name, but there was no response. Desperate and driven by a growing sense of dread, she ran to find the building manager and pleaded for access to Kathy's apartment. Though the manager hesitated, knowing it was against policy to allow entry without the tenant's permission, she relented upon seeing the alarm in Sarah's eyes. The lock clicked open, and Sarah stepped inside, her breath catching in her throat. The apartment was neat and orderly, the way Kathy always kept it. Nothing appeared out of place, and yet it was painfully obvious that Kathy hadn't been home in some time. Around the same time, about 15 miles away, an airman driving to the local Air Force base noticed something lying in the grass along a quiet 2-lane road. As he drew closer, he realized that what he had seen wasn't discarded trash or debris, but something much worse. The airman pulled over, walked into the tall, unkempt grass, and stared in shock at what lay before him. It was a woman's body, contorted in a way that seemed unnatural, disturbing. He felt a chill run down his spine as he rushed back to his car and sped to the nearest house to call the police. Officers arrived within minutes, their sirens piercing the silence of the desolate road. They moved toward the tall grass where the airman had found the body, their expressions hardening as they took in the sight. The young woman was unclothed, her skin pale under the morning sun, and there were faint trails of blood on the corners of her mouth. Her legs were bent, and her arms were arranged in a pose that struck the officers as deliberate, almost staged. It didn't look like a hasty act of disposal, but rather something far more sinister, a message left behind by the one who had taken her life. As investigators combed the scene for clues, Sergeant Marin of the Bexar County Sheriff's Office sat at his desk, reviewing the initial reports. The victim was believed to be a teenager at first glance, but something about the case felt off to Marin, even from the outset. As more details trickled in, the picture grew even murkier, and Kathy's unexplained absence took on a darker implication. Marin wasn't the only one beginning to suspect the worst. At the clinic, Sarah Bowers and Kathy's other colleagues shared the growing unease. The friendly banter that typically filled the air was replaced by hushed conversations and worried glances. The absence of their usually dependable coworker was more than an inconvenience. It was a shadow, growing longer by the hour, stretching toward a darkness none of them wanted to confront. In the days to come, the faint hope that Kathy would simply walk back through the clinic doors began to fade. The investigation was about to take a turn, one that would bring secrets to light and force those close to Kathy to question everything they thought they knew. When the initial description of the victim was released, it was believed she was a young girl, perhaps in her late teens, adding an extra layer of horror to the discovery. Sergeant Marin, a seasoned investigator, had seen many disturbing scenes in his career, but something about this one felt different. The way the body had been positioned, as if someone had carefully arranged her there, unsettled him. It wasn't just a random act of violence. It seemed deliberate, almost calculated. Marin sat in his office, reviewing the photographs taken at the scene. The young woman's body lay in the grass, her legs bent awkwardly at the knee, ankles crossed, and her torso folded over her legs. There was a piece of cloth placed under her foot, her own clothes. It seemed rolled up rather than folded, suggesting a level of precision and intent. The positioning made it appear almost ritualistic, and Marin couldn't shake the feeling that whoever did this wanted the body to be found in exactly that manner. He wondered if the perpetrator had left other messages, ones that might not be immediately obvious. The autopsy report soon arrived, revealing more unsettling details. The victim had been subjected to an assault, and the cause of death was confirmed as strangulation. It likely occurred late on Sunday, a day before her body was found. There were 4 strands of long red hair recovered from the scene, placed carefully on the victim's body. That the victim herself was blonde, a detail that hinted at the possibility of a second person's involvement, or at least an intentional attempt to mislead the investigation. As Marin combed through the crime scene report, his unease only deepened. He had seen instances where killers displayed their victims, but those cases were usually acts of rage, driven by personal connections. This felt cold, methodical, as if someone was toying with the investigation. The more he examined the case, the more convinced he became that they were dealing with someone who had planned this out, not an impulsive outburst of violence. The rolled-up clothing particularly caught his eye. It reminded him of military training, where soldiers are taught to roll clothes tightly for packing. Marin scribbled the word military in the margins of his notes, feeling a chill of recognition. The clues seemed to be pointing towards someone familiar with the Air Force. While Marin was piecing together his theories, another break in the case occurred. A friend of Kathy's contacted the medical examiner's office after seeing the description on the news. Despite the belief that the victim was a teenager, this friend couldn't shake the gut feeling that it was Kathy. The friend had gone to Kathy's apartment herself before calling the authorities, a fact that added another layer of confusion to the already complicated investigation. With Kathy's identity confirmed, Marin's focus shifted to retracing her last known movements. It became clear that Kathy's life had recently undergone dramatic changes: a pending divorce, a new relationship, and a new apartment in a neighborhood that some might call questionable. These details painted a picture of a woman trying to rebuild herself, perhaps even escaping something, but it didn't offer any answers about why she had met such a fate. If anything, it complicated the narrative. Marin wondered if Kathy's fresh start had somehow made her a target. Bill, Kathy's estranged husband, sat in a police interview room when Marin approached him with the grim news. Bill appeared composed, albeit pale, as Marin delivered his condolences and began asking questions. Bill's alibi seemed solid. He claimed he had been with their 2 young children all weekend. He was calm, maybe too calm, as he recounted how Kathy had moved into her new apartment only a week before. His disapproval of the area was evident, and he spoke about it with a hint of bitterness that Marin noticed. It wasn't uncommon for divorces to create animosity, and in cases like these, strained relationships often provided a motive. Yet, as Marin glanced over Bill, he saw no signs of a struggle, no visible injuries that might indicate a recent altercation. Marin asked if there was anyone in the Air Force who might have harbored a grudge against Bill or Kathy, but Bill flatly denied it. He insisted that his relationships at work were good and that Kathy had been well-liked. As the interview drew to a close, Bill's frustration seemed to rise. He gritted his teeth when discussing Kathy's choice to live in what he considered a seedy area. It was clear that the separation was still fresh and painful for him, but if there was more beneath the surface, Bill wasn't showing it. The search for answers led Marin to Kathy's circle of friends and colleagues. who painted a more detailed picture of her life in the months leading up to her death. It was then that Marin learned about Kathy's new boyfriend, Dr. David Pearl. Kathy's friends were quick to share their skepticism about the relationship. The doctor was married, and rumors suggested he wasn't exactly faithful. He had a reputation as a charmer who kept a separate apartment for his rendezvous, away from the prying eyes of his wife. To many of Kathy's friends, this affair seemed reckless, especially with the divorce not yet finalized. Marin couldn't help but see this as a potential motive. Could Dr. Pearl have been trying to cover up an affair that went too far? Or was there something about the relationship that had pushed someone else to the edge? Dr. Pearl's demeanor when he came in for questioning didn't betray much. He appeared calm, polished even, as if unruffled by the entire situation. He expressed shock over Kathy's death, but offered little in the way of useful information. When Marin pressed him about his last meeting with Kathy, Dr. Pearl's demeanor shifted subtly, and he requested a lawyer. It was a move that Marin anticipated, yet it only deepened his suspicion. With Kathy's identity known and the investigation into her personal life in full swing, new details continued to emerge, further muddying the waters. One neighbor reported seeing a woman with long red hair lingering near Kathy's door on the same day her body was found. It was an odd coincidence, given the red hairs found at the crime scene, but without more information, Marin could only catalog it as another piece of the puzzle. The neighbor's description was vague, offering no solid leads to follow. Days turned into weeks, and despite Marin's best efforts, every promising lead seemed to dissolve into nothing. The red-haired woman remained unidentified. Dr. Pearl's lawyer kept him from saying anything incriminating, and Bill Lipscomb's alibi held up. Even the forensic evidence was limited, as Kathy's car, found a mile from her apartment, yielded no usable fingerprints. Whoever was responsible had been thorough, wiping away any trace of themselves. As weeks went by with no significant progress, Marin's frustration grew. Each dead end led him back to the beginning, forcing him to reconsider the clues as if he were missing something obvious. The media attention surrounding the case waned, and newer crimes took precedence over Kathy's. The weight of unsolved cases accumulated on Marin's desk, but the haunting image of Kathy's posed body lingered in his mind. He returned to her case file repeatedly, desperate to spot what he had overlooked. Yet, with each review, Marin could only confirm what he already knew. This was not a crime of passion, but of intention. Someone had gone to great lengths to mislead the investigation, to create a scene that spoke in riddles. But why? And for whom was the message intended? As the investigation stalled, Kathy's family struggled with the uncertainty, reaching out to Marin regularly for updates. There were no answers to offer them, only apologies and assurances that the case had not been forgotten. It wasn't until years later, when a private investigator was brought in by Kathy's mother, that a new light began to shine on the case. The investigator's discovery of Kathy's datebook provided Marin with his first solid lead in years, but it also brought new questions. What was the significance of the entries related to something called the WAPS test? It sounded like an exam of some sort, and as Marin's curiosity was piqued, the case seemed to shift once again, the scattered clues starting to form a clearer picture. As Marin examined the cryptic entries, he focused on one phrase that appeared multiple times: WAPS test. It wasn't clear what it meant, but a little digging revealed that WAPS stood for Weighted Airman Promotion System, a testing program used by the Air Force. Kathy had made several references to this test, and it appeared someone she knew had access to the answers. The possibility of cheating seemed far removed from the tragedy that had unfolded, but the details in the datebook couldn't be ignored. Marin's thoughts returned to Bill Lipscomb, Kathy's estranged husband and a career Air Force member. As he considered the possibility of a connection between the test entries and Bill, It occurred to Marin that Kathy might have known something that put her in danger. Perhaps there had been more than just marital strife pushing them apart. Marin decided it was time to revisit Bill's alibi and dig deeper into his life at the Air Force Base. When questioned again, Bill maintained his original story. He had been with the children all weekend, and they could confirm that. His tone was impatient, as though he felt persecuted, but Marin pressed on. He asked Bill about the WAPS test, and for a brief moment, Bill's demeanor shifted. It was a subtle change, a tightening around the eyes that Marin almost missed. Bill responded in a flat voice that the WAPS test was standard for promotions, and he didn't see how it had anything to do with Kathy's death. The conversation didn't yield much more, but the shift in Bill's expression lingered in Marin's mind. The investigator had a gut feeling that Bill wasn't telling the whole story. The datebook indicated Kathy had known something significant, and it was possible she had used that knowledge as leverage in the divorce. If so, Marin wondered, had that pressure escalated into something more dangerous? Meanwhile, Marin turned his attention back to Dr. David Pearl, Kathy's boyfriend. Despite his calm exterior during their first interview, Marin couldn't help but suspect that the doctor was hiding something. His refusal to speak without a lawyer had seemed too convenient, especially given the rumors about his reputation. When Marin went back through Kathy's datebook, he found more notes that mentioned David, but they didn't reveal much beyond what he already knew. There was nothing in the entries that directly tied Dr. Pearl to the WAPS test or any potential cheating scandal. Nonetheless, Marin arranged to bring Dr. Pearl in for a second round of questioning. This time, the doctor arrived with his lawyer in tow, clearly prepared to offer as little information as possible. Marin approached the interview from a different angle, asking Dr. Pearl if he had noticed any changes in Kathy's behavior leading up to her death. The doctor answered cautiously, saying that Kathy had seemed stressed about her separation from Bill, but hadn't mentioned anything unusual or threatening. Marin shifted gears, bringing up the datebook entries. He asked if Dr. Pearl had ever heard Kathy mention the WAPS test, or if she had discussed anything related to the Air Force. The doctor's lawyer intervened, advising him not to answer. The interview ended shortly thereafter, with Dr. Pearl's lawyer making it clear that their cooperation would not extend beyond what was legally required. Despite the lack of a breakthrough, Marin couldn't ignore the feeling that Dr. Pearl knew more than he was letting on. The doctor's relationship with Kathy, though seemingly unrelated to her murder, may have complicated her life in ways that extended beyond just romance. If Kathy had indeed uncovered something about the WPS test, Dr. Pearl's awareness of it could be the missing link that tied together the scattered pieces of the case. As Marin continued to explore the theory of the cheating scandal, he interviewed several Air Force personnel who had worked with Bill. Most of them expressed shock and disbelief that a highly ranked sergeant like Bill could be involved in anything improper. One airman mentioned, however, that Bill had risen through the ranks unusually fast, securing promotions that seemed almost too good to be true. The comment was casual, made offhandedly, but it struck Marin as an important thread to follow. The possibility that Bill had obtained answers to the WAPS test could explain his rapid advancement, and if Kathy had threatened to expose him, it might also explain why she had been targeted. Marin sought access to the Air Force base records, hoping to find anything that might connect Bill to the cheating scandal. It was a difficult process, as military records are often guarded with strict confidentiality, but after persistent efforts, Marin was able to gain limited access. The records did indeed show that Bill had taken the WAPS test around the same time. Kathy's datebook suggested someone had access to the answers. Although there was no direct evidence linking Bill to cheating, the timing was suspicious. Marin was beginning to see a pattern that was hard to dismiss. If Kathy had discovered that Bill was cheating on the test, she could have used it as leverage during the divorce, a threat that Bill might not have taken lightly. Still, the lack of physical evidence tying Bill or Dr. Pearl directly to the crime scene left Marin frustrated. He couldn't charge anyone based on theories alone, and both men maintained plausible deniability. Then there was the matter of the red hair found on Kathy's body, a detail that hadn't led to any solid leads. The mysterious red-haired woman reported by the neighbor hadn't resurfaced, and Marin was left wondering if she had simply been a distraction, an intentional misdirection set up by the killer. It was around this time that the private investigator hired by Kathy's family uncovered a crucial piece of information that had been overlooked. Kathy's daughter had something to say. The young girl, now a little older and able to articulate more clearly, revealed a detail that no one had known before. She admitted that on the night Kathy had disappeared, she and her brother had not actually been with their father as they had originally said. Instead, they had been with one of Bill's friends, a man named Clint Richards. The revelation hit Marin like a jolt. Clint Richards was a familiar name. He had been one of the airmen questioned early in the investigation, but at the time, he had seemed of little consequence. Now, with this new information, Marin saw the situation in a different light. If Clint had taken the children while Bill was free to act, it could mean that Bill had orchestrated the entire scenario, using Clint to establish a false alibi. Marin immediately brought Clint back in for questioning. Unlike their previous encounter, this time Clint seemed nervous. As Marin pressed him about the night in question, Clint's responses grew hesitant, his gaze shifting uncomfortably. He stuck to his story, insisting he had simply watched the kids while Bill handled some personal matters. But when Marin asked him directly if he had been involved in transporting Kathy's body or tampering with the crime scene, Clint's composure cracked. Under the weight of the interrogation, Clint confessed that he had indeed helped Bill on the night Kathy died. He claimed he didn't know what Bill had planned and had been shocked when Bill revealed Kathy's body. According to Clint, Bill had instructed him to assist in staging the scene to make it look like a random, gruesome crime. The red hairs, the positioning of the body, it had all been part of Bill's twisted plan to mislead investigators and buy himself time. With Clint's confession, Marin finally had the break he needed. The pieces were falling into place, but questions still remained. Why had Bill gone to such elaborate lengths to cover up his tracks? And what role, if any, had the WAPS test played in Kathy's fate? Marin felt closer to answers than ever. Yet he knew there was still more to uncover before the whole truth could come to light. Clint had helped Bill transport Kathy's body from the apartment, and then the two men had staged the scene on that lonely road. Every detail had been designed to throw off investigators. The unnatural positioning of her body, the rolled-up clothes under her foot, and the carefully placed strands of red hair. Clint's account painted a picture of Bill as a calculating and desperate man, willing to manipulate those around him to protect himself. When pressed for more details, Clint claimed he hadn't known Kathy was dead until it was too late. Bill had already hidden her body in a chest by the time Clint arrived, and he had made it clear that Clint's job was to assist in moving it. No questions asked. Clint said he had felt trapped, unable to refuse. Marin had his doubts about Clint's level of involvement, but for now, the confession gave him enough leverage to go after Bill with renewed vigor. As Marin pushed forward, he continued to probe into the WAPS test angle. Clint's confession had established Bill's motive as one of self-preservation, but Marin needed to confirm whether the cheating scandal had been the catalyst for Kathy's murder. He reached out to other Air Force personnel who had taken the test around the same time. Some mentioned hearing rumors about answers circulating before the exam, but no one admitted to any direct knowledge. Still, the rumor mill suggested that cheating was more widespread than the Air Force was willing to acknowledge. The breakthrough came when Marin stumbled upon a retired airman who had once been close to Bill. The man, a former colleague named Gary Maddox, reluctantly agreed to talk. Over a cup of coffee, Gary explained that back when Bill was taking the WAPS test, there had been a lot of pressure to advance quickly. Promotion opportunities were scarce, and the competition was fierce. For some, cutting corners was an unspoken secret. When Marin asked him if he believed Bill had cheated, Gary hesitated. "All I'll say is Bill always seemed to know things that he shouldn't have," he muttered, stirring his coffee. Gary's words were vague, but they hinted at something deeper. A network of individuals who had shared the answers to the test. A secret that had remained buried within the ranks. If Kathy had indeed discovered this network and threatened to expose it during the divorce, it could have motivated Bill to silence her. As Marin began to connect the dots, he saw a disturbing pattern emerge. The red hairs, the military-style precision in the staging of the scene, and Clint's involvement all suggested that Kathy's murder had been more than just an act of rage. It had been a calculated decision to protect a career and cover up a scandal that could have ruined multiple lives. With Clint's cooperation, Marin secured a warrant to search Bill's property. There, in the attic, he found documents related to the WAPS test, including a handwritten note containing what appeared to be answers to some of the exam questions. This evidence was the smoking gun Marin had been searching for. It connected Bill to the cheating scheme, reinforcing the theory that Kathy's knowledge of his illicit activities was what sealed her fate. Marin felt a grim satisfaction as the pieces of the puzzle finally began to fit together. As Bill was brought in for questioning, his demeanor remained unflinching. He still presented himself as the respectable Air Force sergeant, and his calmness bordered on arrogance. But as Marin laid out the evidence, Clint's confession, the recovered documents, and Gary's statements, Bill's expression hardened. It was as though the facade he had carefully constructed began to crack. Marin could see the flicker of fear in his eyes, but Bill remained tight-lipped. In the days that followed, Clint's confession allowed Marin to reconstruct the events leading up to Kathy's death with greater accuracy. Bill had manipulated Kathy's trust, luring her to his apartment that fateful night under the pretense of discussing arrangements for the children. When Kathy arrived, the atmosphere quickly shifted. She had sensed something was wrong, but Bill had been prepared. He overpowered her, using an electrical cord he had placed nearby, knowing it would be there when he needed it. Clint was called in later, not as a participant in the actual crime, but as a complicit accessory in the disposal and staging of the body. The arrangement of Kathy's body on that remote road was a carefully orchestrated deception, meant to suggest a disturbed stranger had been responsible. The inclusion of the red hairs, taken from a wig Bill had in his possession, was intended to throw off the investigation entirely. But while Bill had gone to great lengths to divert attention, his elaborate measures had ultimately been his undoing. The more complex the cover-up, the more threads there were to unravel, and Marin had found just enough to pull the entire scheme apart. The revelation of Kathy's murder being tied to the WAPS test scandal shook the Air Force community. For many, it was a rude awakening to the lengths some individuals would go to protect their careers and reputations. Marin could feel the weight of the case lifting, but there was one final piece that still troubled him. Kathy's children. They had been unwitting participants in their father's lies, instructed to tell a story that wasn't true, shielding him from suspicion. It was a cruel manipulation that had kept them in the dark about their mother's fate. Marin visited the Lipscomb children one last time, this time accompanied by a family liaison to help them process what had happened. Now older, Kathy's daughter finally spoke with a clarity that had eluded her years earlier. She recalled the small but significant details that had lingered in her memory. The odd hush around her father's apartment that night, the absence of her mother's voice. She had always known something was wrong, but had been too young to fully understand. As the truth came to light, Marin could see a mixture of relief and sadness wash over her face, as though she had finally been freed from a lie she had carried without knowing. Bill Lipscomb was charged with Kathy's murder, and as the case went to trial, the full story emerged in the courtroom. Clint testified, his voice wavering as he recounted the night he helped Bill dispose of Kathy's body. The evidence of the cheating scheme and Bill's desperate measures to protect himself sealed the case for the prosecution. It wasn't just about one man's actions, but about a system that allowed secrets to fester in dark, decisions to be made in the name of ambition. As Marin watched Bill being led away in handcuffs, there was no sense of triumph, only a bittersweet feeling of closure. The case had haunted him for years, and while justice had finally been served, it had come at a steep cost. The truth was out, but Kathy's life was gone forever, leaving behind a broken family and memories that would never heal completely. For Kathy's family, it was a bittersweet victory. Justice had been served, but it couldn't bring her back. He had solved the case, uncovered the truth about Kathy's death, but he couldn't help wondering if it had all come a little too late. The military was forced to confront uncomfortable truths about the culture of silence and complicity that had allowed unethical practices to go unchecked. Promotions were scrutinized, and the ripple effect of the scandal reached far beyond Bill's actions, affecting careers and lives in ways that could never be fully measured. He avoided prison time by agreeing to a plea deal that required him to testify in detail about his role in Kathy's death and the cover-up. Clint's confession painted him as a reluctant accomplice, but many questioned just how much he knew and whether he had truly been as unaware as he claimed. He had played his part in Bill's plan, and while he might have escaped the full consequences of the law, the weight of his choices would follow him for the rest of his life. It was a burden no child should ever have to carry, and despite the support from extended family and counselors, there were wounds that would take a lifetime to heal. Kathy's daughter, now old enough to understand the full scope of what had happened, carried a quiet anger. It wasn't just for the loss of her mother, but for the years spent in confusion, unknowingly protecting a lie. He knew that for Kathy's mother, the grief had taken a toll that words could never fully capture. The older woman had fought relentlessly for answers, never accepting that the case would grow cold. It was her determination that had led to the involvement of the private investigator and, ultimately, the breakthrough in the investigation. Though the truth was finally out, it was a harsh comfort, one that brought a kind of closure that was still wrapped in sorrow. It was a reminder of the darkness that people are capable of when driven by desperation and fear. He had seen the worst that ambition could breed, how it could corrupt, consume, and destroy lives. The revelation of Bill's cheating and his willingness to go to extreme lengths to protect. His secret had shown just how deep that darkness could run. He was determined to get out of prison earlier than expected, despite the severity of his crime. The thought made Marin's blood simmer, but he knew that the justice system would take its course. Bill had spent years manipulating others, using deception as his shield, and while it was possible, he might find some technicality to exploit, the full truth of what he had done would never be erased. There was no escaping the fact that he had taken a life and shattered a family. Whether or not he truly regretted his actions was something only Bill himself knew, but his release sparked outrage among those who had followed the case. For Kathy's family, it was like reopening a wound that had never fully healed. The outrage was understandable. There had been a promise of justice, a sense that Bill would face the full consequences of his choices. Yet here he was, walking free after just a few short years. But even in her weakened state, she refused to stay silent. She spoke out against the decision, calling it an insult to her daughter's memory and a betrayal of justice. Her voice trembled, but there was a fire in her words that showed she would not give up, even now. Marin, though no longer directly involved, kept an eye on Bill, expecting that the man might slip back into his old ways. There were rumors that Bill had reconnected with some old military contacts, but nothing concrete emerged. It was as if he had managed to slip back into the shadows, hoping to disappear from public scrutiny. Yet, Marin knew that some stains could never be washed away. It had been a long journey, full of twists and turns, with moments of despair and triumph. But the conclusion left a sense of unfinished business, a feeling that Kathy's story had not been fully told. There were still unanswered questions about the extent of the WPS test scandal, about who else might have known what Bill had done, and about the forces that allowed him to manipulate the system so effectively. The haunting memory of Kathy's story served as a stark reminder that justice, though pursued with the best intentions, was not always as definitive as it seemed. The darkness that had surrounded her death was a part of life he had learned to accept, but it was one he would never be comfortable with. As the years went on, Kathy's case became a ghost that followed him, a story he would tell younger detectives, not just to share his experience, but as a warning about the lengths people will go to bury the truth and the need for perseverance in uncovering it. In the late 1930s, as the world teetered on the brink of war, the quiet English countryside in Suffolk held secrets long buried beneath the earth. The land, rolling in green, had a gentle way of keeping its past concealed. But for Edith Pretty, the owner of Sutton Hoo Estate, the ancient burial mounds on her property stirred her curiosity. Edith was a wealthy widow in her 50s, and despite her age, she possessed an adventurous spirit. She had always been fascinated by history and archaeology. After years of living on the estate and gazing at the mounds, she began to wonder what lay beneath them. Her interest grew after hearing local legends that these mounds might hide long-lost treasures, perhaps even the resting place of kings. It was the summer of 1938 when Edith finally decided to act. She had been reading articles on recent archaeological digs and, inspired, she contacted the local Ipswich Museum for advice. They recommended Basil Brown, a self-taught archaeologist with a passion for unearthing history. Though not formally trained, Brown had a deep knowledge of the land and a reputation for careful, thorough work. Edith invited him to the estate, and soon an agreement was made to begin exploring the mysterious mounds. Basil Brown was not a man of wealth or high education, but he possessed a talent that few others did a sense of the land. He had an ability to read the earth and understand its secrets. When he first set foot on Sutton Hoo, he was struck by the sheer size of the mounds. Some were as tall as trees, looming over the landscape like sentinels guarding something precious. The excavation began in earnest, but no one could have imagined what they were about to uncover. The first few days were slow. Basil and his small team of laborers worked carefully, mindful not to damage anything. They had no idea what lay beneath, whether it would be an empty mound or something extraordinary. At first, the dig revealed little more than small fragments of iron and decayed wood, signs that the mound had been disturbed before. Yet Basil remained optimistic. He knew that patience was key. As the team continued to remove layers of earth, something remarkable began to take shape, the outline of a ship. Brown could hardly believe his eyes. The sandy soil had preserved an impression of a ship, large enough to befit royalty. The wood had long since decayed, leaving only a ghostly imprint, but the form of the ship was unmistakable. It stretched nearly 90 feet long, a size that suggested this was no ordinary burial. This was something far grander. Word of the discovery spread quickly. Edith Pretty herself came to the site daily, watching with excitement as the ancient vessel emerged from the soil. She had hoped for something significant, but the magnitude of what was being uncovered exceeded her wildest dreams. The ship's structure, though fragile and partially destroyed by time, was evidence of a culture that had mastery over the sea. But it wasn't just the size of the ship that astonished the team. As they dug deeper, they realized that the vessel had been used as a burial ship, likely for someone of great importance. The thought lingered. Could this be the resting place of a long-forgotten king? Excitement turned to trepidation as the team carefully uncovered more of the ship. The scale of the task ahead became clearer. This was not a simple dig. It was a mission to recover a piece of history so old that its very existence had been forgotten. Every move had to be precise, every piece of earth removed with care. Basil Brown knew the significance of what they had found, but he also understood the risks. An excavation of this scale had never been attempted before in England, at least not with such a delicate site. The ship was a marvel, but it was fragile. Any mistake could destroy what little remained. As more of the ship was revealed, it became clear that this was not an isolated find. The ship was part of a much larger burial complex, perhaps one used by an elite group of people warriors, leaders, and rulers. The ship had been placed in the earth with great care, loaded with treasures meant to accompany its occupant into the afterlife. By the end of the summer, the excavation had gained attention beyond Suffolk. Archaeologists from across Britain began to take notice. The press, too, caught wind of the discovery. Headlines soon spoke of Britain's greatest find, and speculation ran wild about the identity of the person buried within the ship. Some believed it could be a legendary king or warrior, a figure whose story had been lost to time. Despite the growing attention, Edith Pretty remained modest about her role in the discovery. She had simply acted on a hunch, following her curiosity. But as the ship continued to reveal its secrets, it became clear that her decision to explore the mounds was one that would reshape the understanding of England's ancient history. The discovery of the ship set the stage for a much larger adventure, one that would continue to unfold in the months and years to come. For now, though, the ship lay beneath the soil, waiting for its full story to be told. As the sun rose over the fields of Suffolk in the summer of 1939, a small team of workers arrived at Sutton Hoo, eager to continue their excavation of what was shaping up to be one of the most remarkable finds in British history. Basil Brown, the archaeologist leading the dig, had uncovered the outline of an ancient ship. But what lay beneath was still a mystery. The real work was only just beginning. The excavation site, now buzzing with activity, was far from a glamorous operation. With no heavy machinery and only simple tools like shovels, trowels, and brushes, the work was slow, meticulous, and physically demanding. Each layer of soil had to be removed carefully to avoid disturbing any fragile artifacts that might lie beneath the surface. Time was not on their side, as the threat of war loomed over Europe, adding urgency to their efforts. A small team of workers, mostly local laborers, had little formal training in archaeology, but they followed his instructions diligently. He had a deep respect for the past, and he knew that any mistake, no matter how small, could erase vital clues to understanding the burial. The ship they had uncovered was not made of iron or stone. It had once been a grand wooden vessel. Over the centuries, the wood had decayed, leaving only the impression of the ship in the soil. This meant that the entire outline of the ship was incredibly delicate, requiring precision to uncover it without causing damage. As they dug deeper, the true size of the ship became more apparent. Nearly 90 feet long, it was the kind of ship that could only have belonged to someone of great importance. It wasn't just its size that amazed the team. It was the craftsmanship. The lines of the ship's hull were graceful, curving elegantly through the earth, a testament to the shipbuilders who had constructed it more than 1,000 years earlier. Brown's excitement grew as the excavation progressed, but so did his sense of responsibility. The discovery of the ship was already monumental, but he knew there had to be more. Anglo-Saxon burial customs suggested that whoever was buried here had been laid to rest with treasures fit for a king. The ship, it seemed, was just the beginning. As the days passed, the team began to uncover a wealth of small finds, pieces of iron, fragments of pottery, and even a few rusted nails that hinted at the ship's construction. These items were important, but they were not the treasures the team had hoped to find. Still, Basil remained patient. He knew that the most valuable artifacts were likely still hidden deeper within the burial chamber, and he was determined to reach them The dig became more challenging as they approached the center of the ship, where the burial chamber was believed to be. The earth here was heavier, and the signs of earlier disturbances, likely grave robbers from centuries past, became more evident. Some parts of the ship had been damaged, either by the passage of time or by human hands, but there were still large sections of the vessel that remained untouched. One day, as the team carefully removed soil from the center of the ship, they uncovered something extraordinary: a large wooden structure that had once formed the burial chamber. Though the wood itself had long since decayed, the impression it left behind was unmistakable. The chamber was large enough to hold not only a body, but also the treasures that would have accompanied it. Basil Brown was struck by the enormity of what they had found. This wasn't just a ship burial, it was a royal tomb. The chamber was situated in the very heart of the ship, a place of honor reserved for someone of the highest status. Though the chamber had been damaged over the centuries, there were still signs that it had once held magnificent items. The team worked slowly, methodically, removing the earth surrounding the chamber. As they did, they began to find objects that hinted at the grandeur of the burial. The first signs were small metal fragments, delicate pieces of jewelry, and the remnants of finely crafted items that had once adorned the body. These objects, though decayed, were exquisite in their design, suggesting that the person buried here had been incredibly wealthy, perhaps even a king. But the true treasures of the burial had not yet been uncovered. Brown knew that the most significant finds were still hidden beneath layers of soil. The team worked tirelessly, day after day, uncovering more and more of the burial chamber. The anticipation was palpable. Every piece of earth they removed brought them closer to the moment of revelation. As the excavation continued, word of the discovery spread even further. Archaeologists from across the country began to take notice, and some even traveled to Sutton Hoo to witness the dig for themselves. It was becoming clear that this was no ordinary excavation. What they had uncovered was one of the greatest archaeological finds in British history, and it was only a matter of time before the world would know the full extent of the discovery. Despite the growing attention, Basil Brown remained focused on the task at hand. The pressure was immense, but he knew that they were on the verge of something incredible. The burial chamber was nearly fully exposed, and soon they would uncover the treasures that had been hidden for centuries. As the final layers of earth were removed from the chamber, the team began to realize just how grand the burial truly was. They found evidence of finely wrought metalwork, including gold and silver items that had once adorned the person buried within. Though many of the treasures had been damaged or lost to time, what remained was enough to suggest that this was the burial of someone truly significant. The discovery of the burial chamber was a turning point in the excavation. What had begun as a simple curiosity had become a full-scale archaeological dig, one that would change the understanding of early medieval England. For Basil Brown and his team, the discovery of the ship and the chamber was just the beginning of a much larger story, one that would unfold in the months and years to come. The discovery of the burial chamber at Sutton Hoo marked a turning point in the excavation. The ship had been a stunning find, but the treasures hidden within the chamber were what truly revealed the significance of this ancient burial. As Basil Brown and his team carefully removed the last layers of soil, they began to uncover a collection of artifacts that hinted at the immense wealth and status of the person entombed within. The burial chamber, located at the heart of the ship, had likely once contained a wooden coffin, though all traces of the wood had long since decayed. What remained, however, was a dazzling array of items that had been placed alongside the body items that spoke of a life of power, influence, and high social standing. This was no ordinary grave. This was the final resting place of someone of immense importance, perhaps even a king. One of the first objects to emerge from the soil was a magnificent helmet. Though damaged by time and the elements, it was clear that this was no simple piece of armor. The helmet was adorned with intricate designs, including representations of fierce animals and warriors, all crafted in exquisite detail. It had once been worn by a figure of great significance, someone who likely commanded both respect and fear. The helmet, with its mask-like faceplate and iron cheek pieces, gave the impression of a powerful warrior king. Its craftsmanship suggested that the person buried here had connections to distant lands, perhaps Scandinavia, where similar helmets had been found. As the team continued to excavate, they uncovered more treasures. A finely wrought sword was found next, its hilt inlaid with gold and garnets. The sword was a symbol of power, not just a weapon, but a representation of the authority of the one who had wielded it. Alongside the sword were other items associated with warfare, including a large shield and a collection of spears. These were the tools of a leader, someone who had commanded armies and fought in battles. The items painted a picture of a man who had been both a ruler and a warrior, a figure whose life had been shaped by conflict and conquest. Yet the burial chamber also contained objects of great beauty, items that suggested the person buried here had enjoyed a life of luxury and refinement. Gold buckles, intricately crafted jewelry, and a collection of silverware were found, each piece more ornate than the last. Some of the items had been imported from far-off lands, including silver bowls and spoons from the Byzantine Empire, evidence of trade and cultural connections that spanned continents. These items showed that the person buried here had lived in a time when England was not an isolated island, but part of a wider world, a world connected by trade routes and diplomacy. Perhaps the most striking find was a large, elaborately decorated belt buckle made of solid gold. Weighing over a pound, the buckle was a masterpiece of craftsmanship, featuring interwoven patterns that symbolized strength and unity. Its size and weight suggested that it had been worn by someone of great stature, both physically and socially. The buckle, along with the other treasures, spoke of immense wealth, the kind of wealth that only the most powerful in society could accumulate. As the team cataloged the items found in the burial chamber, it became increasingly clear that this was not just a burial, it was a statement. The person buried here had wanted to be remembered, to leave a lasting legacy. The ship, the treasures, and the sheer scale of the burial all suggested that this had been a leader of extraordinary influence, someone who had shaped the course of history in their time. But who was this person? That question lingered over the excavation like a shadow. No body had been found in the burial chamber. Centuries of decay had left little more than traces of organic matter where the body once lay. Still, archaeologists were able to piece together clues from the artifacts and the burial itself. The size of the ship and the opulence of the treasures suggested that this was the grave of an Anglo-Saxon king, perhaps even Redwald, the ruler of East Anglia in the early 7th century. Redwald was a powerful figure in Anglo-Saxon England. According to historical records, he had been a strong leader who wielded significant influence over other kings in the region. He had converted to Christianity, but also maintained traditional pagan beliefs, a fact reflected in the mix of Christian and pagan symbols found in the burial chamber. If this was indeed the grave of Redwald, it would confirm his status as one of the most important figures of the Anglo-Saxon period. The burial also revealed much about the society in which this leader had lived. The treasures found in the chamber were not just symbols of personal wealth. They were representations of the interconnectedness of early medieval Europe. The silver from Byzantium, the garnets from India, and the craftsmanship influenced by Scandinavian designs all pointed to a world in which goods, ideas, and cultures flowed across borders. But while the items found in the burial chamber were awe-inspiring, they also raised questions. What had caused this king to be buried in such a grand manner? Had his death been the result of natural causes, or had he fallen in battle? Had this burial been a display of his people's devotion, or was it meant to send a message to those who came after him? The ship, laden with treasures, seemed to speak of a desire to carry these symbols of power into the afterlife, a belief that even in death, this leader would continue to hold sway over the world. As the excavation came to an end, the team knew they had uncovered something truly extraordinary. The burial chamber at Sutton Hoo had revealed treasures that had been hidden for more than 1,000 years. Treasures that told the story of a long-forgotten king and the world in which he had lived. For Basil Brown and his team, it was the culmination of months of hard work and dedication. But for the wider world, it was just the beginning of a new understanding of England's past. The treasures of Sutton Hoo would soon be displayed in museums, where people from all over the world could come and marvel at the craftsmanship and beauty of these ancient artifacts. Yet, even as they were cleaned and preserved, they would remain tied to the mystery of the person who had been buried in that ship, a figure whose identity might never be known for certain, but whose legacy would live on through the objects he left behind. The burial chamber had been unearthed, but its secrets would continue to captivate the imaginations of historians, archaeologists, and the public for generations to come. The excavation at Sutton Hoo had revealed extraordinary treasures, but it was the discovery's ripple effect that truly began to reshape the understanding of England's ancient past. As word of the find spread across Britain, the magnitude of what had been uncovered became clear, not just to archaeologists, but to the general public, scholars, and even political figures. The Sutton Hoo ship burial was quickly recognized as one of the most important archaeological finds in British history, a window into a time that had long been shrouded in mystery. In the summer of 1939, just as the treasures from Sutton Hoo were being carefully excavated, the world was on the brink of conflict. The tensions leading to the outbreak of World War II were mounting, and in many ways, the discovery at Sutton Hoo served as a reminder of Britain's deep history and resilience. As the nation prepared for the uncertainties of war, the treasures from this ancient burial offered a sense of pride and continuity, connecting modern Britons to their Anglo-Saxon ancestors. For Edith Pretty, the landowner whose curiosity had sparked the excavation, the discovery had an emotional impact. She had long suspected that the mounds on her estate hid something special, but even she couldn't have imagined the grandeur of what lay beneath. Edith, a reserved and thoughtful woman, had always been interested in history and archaeology, but the scale of the find at Sutton Hoo exceeded her wildest expectations. She visited the excavation site daily, quietly observing as Basil Brown and his team painstakingly unearthed each artifact. Though Edith had initiated the dig, she remained humble about her role, insisting that the discovery belonged to history. In the months following the excavation, Edith made a decision that would forever cement her place in the story of Sutton Hoo. Rather than keeping the treasures for herself or selling them, she donated the entire collection to the British Museum. It was an act of generosity that reflected her deep sense of responsibility to history and her desire for the treasures to be studied and preserved for future generations. The decision ensured that the artifacts would be accessible to the public and to scholars, who would spend decades analyzing the find and its implications. The British Museum, which had long been a repository for the world's greatest cultural artifacts, was quick to recognize the importance of the Sutton Hoo treasures. The items, including the famous helmet, the gold belt buckle, and the intricately crafted jewelry, were displayed prominently, attracting visitors from across the country and beyond. People flocked to see the artifacts, eager to catch a glimpse of the ancient past and to learn more about the mysterious figure who had been buried in such splendor. The public reaction to the Sutton Hoo discovery was overwhelming. Newspapers ran headlines about the buried treasure and the king in the ship, fueling speculation about the identity of the person entombed in the ship burial. Theories abounded, with some suggesting that the ship had belonged to a legendary warrior, while others believed it was the resting place of a great king. The fascination with the find extended beyond the borders of Britain. with international scholars and archaeologists expressing interest in studying the artifacts and the burial site. But while the treasures themselves were stunning, it was the broader implications of the discovery that truly excited the academic community. Before Sutton Hoo, the early medieval period in England, often referred to as the Dark Ages, was seen as a time of cultural stagnation, a period following the fall of the Roman Empire, when much of Europe was thought to have fallen into disarray. The Sutton Hoo find challenged this view, offering evidence of a sophisticated and cosmopolitan society that had existed in England in the 6th and 7th centuries. The discovery of objects from distant lands, including silverware from Byzantium and garnets from as far away as India, demonstrated that the Anglo-Saxon elite were part of a vast network of trade and cultural exchange. These connections extended across Europe and beyond, suggesting that early medieval England was far more interconnected with the wider world than previously thought. The items found in the burial chamber revealed a society that valued craftsmanship, artistry, and wealth, a far cry from the image of a dark and isolated age. For historians and archaeologists, the Sutton Hoo ship burial opened up new lines of inquiry. Who was the person buried in the ship, and what did his burial tell us about the society he lived in? The consensus began to form around the idea that the burial belonged to Redwold, the king of East Anglia, a powerful figure who had been instrumental in the politics of early medieval England. While no definitive proof existed to confirm Redwold's identity as the person buried in the ship, the evidence, both historical and archaeological, pointed strongly in that direction. As the academic community delved deeper into the meaning of the Sutton Hoo treasures, the site itself became a point of national pride. The discovery was seen as a testament to Britain's deep and rich history, a reminder that the country's roots extended far back into the early medieval period. This sense of pride was particularly potent in the context of the looming war. As Britain prepared for the possibility of conflict, the Sutton Hoo find served as a symbol of resilience and continuity, a reminder that the nation had weathered countless challenges throughout its long history. However, the outbreak of World War II in September 1939 brought new challenges to the preservation of the Sutton Hoo treasures. The artifacts, now housed in the British Museum, were packed away and moved to secure storage to protect them from potential bombing raids. It would be several years before they could be displayed again, but even in storage, the significance of the find continued to grow. In the years following the war, the treasures of Sutton Hoo were once again placed on display, drawing renewed interest from scholars and the public alike. The site itself became a place of pilgrimage for those interested in England's early medieval past. Archaeological work at Sutton Hoo continued, with new discoveries shedding further light on the burial and the culture that had created it. As time passed, the Sutton Hoo ship burial became more than just an archaeological discovery. It became a symbol of Britain's cultural heritage. The treasures found in the burial chamber were celebrated not just for their beauty, but for what they represented, a connection to the distant past, to a time when kings ruled the land and the seas, and when the Anglo-Saxon people laid the foundations for the England that would emerge in the centuries to come. The impact of Sutton Hoo extended beyond the academic world. It influenced popular culture, inspiring books, films, and even artwork. The treasures, with their intricate designs and mysterious origins, captured the imagination of people around the world. The Sutton Hoo helmet, in particular, became an iconic symbol of Anglo-Saxon England, its distinctive design appearing in countless representations of early medieval warriors. But more than anything, Sutton Hoo stood as a testament to the power of curiosity and perseverance. What had begun as a simple desire to explore a set of burial mounds on a quiet Suffolk estate had led to one of the greatest archaeological discoveries in history. The impact of that discovery would be felt for generations, reminding the world of the enduring legacy of the Anglo-Saxon people and the mysteries that still lay buried beneath the earth. The Sutton Hoo discovery forever altered the understanding of early medieval England. Long after the final artifact had been unearthed and the excavation had concluded, the mysteries of the ship burial continued to captivate historians, archaeologists, and the general public. The artifacts, now safely housed in the British Museum, were more than just relics. They were keys to unlocking a forgotten past, one that had been shrouded in mystery for centuries. As scholars continued to study the treasures, new insights into the life and times of the Anglo-Saxons emerged. The burial itself became a symbol of the sophisticated society that had existed in England during the early 7th century, a society far more complex and interconnected than previously believed. Sutton Hoo had given the world a glimpse into the life of a ruler who had commanded immense respect and wielded significant power, whether it was Redwold, as many believed, or another figure of equal prominence. Despite all that had been uncovered, questions still lingered. Chief among them was the identity of the person buried in the ship. While the evidence pointed strongly to Redwold, the lack of definitive proof left room for debate. Some scholars suggested alternative possibilities, including other kings or powerful nobles from the East Anglian kingdom. The absence of human remains, likely lost to the ravages of time and the acidic soil, meant that the mystery of the burial's occupant might never be fully resolved. Even without a clear identity, the significance of the burial was undeniable. The ship, the treasures, and the careful arrangement of the grave goods all pointed to someone of immense importance. This was a person whose life had been marked by power, prestige, and wealth, someone who had commanded loyalty and respect from those around them. The grandeur of the burial reflected the importance placed on status and honor in Anglo-Saxon society, where kings and nobles were celebrated both in life and in death. The mystery extended beyond the identity of the buried figure. The purpose of the ship burial itself raised questions. Why had such an elaborate ceremony been conducted, and what did it symbolize? Ship burials were rare in England, and the practice was more commonly associated with Scandinavian cultures. Some historians believe that the Sutton Hoo burial was a reflection of the complex cultural influences at play in early medieval England. The Anglo-Saxons, who had come to Britain as invaders, had absorbed elements of both Roman and Scandinavian traditions, creating a unique blend of customs and beliefs. The ship burial, with its mixture of Christian and pagan symbols, suggested that the person buried at Sutton Hoo had navigated a world in which old and new beliefs coexisted. Redwold, if he was indeed the person buried there, had been known for his dual faith embracing Christianity while still honoring traditional pagan practices. The burial reflected this tension, with the treasures revealing a world in which religious beliefs were evolving, but not yet settled. The items found in the burial chamber also offered clues about the broader world in which this person had lived. The silverware from Byzantium, the garnets from India, and the craftsmanship influenced by Scandinavian and Frankish designs all pointed to a world connected by trade and diplomacy. The Sutton Hoo burial was not just a testament to one person's power. It was a reflection of a global network of exchange, where goods and ideas flowed across borders. As the years passed, Sutton Hoo became a touchstone for those studying the early medieval period. Archaeologists continued to explore the site, conducting further excavations and uncovering additional evidence of the Anglo-Saxon people who had once inhabited the area. While no discoveries rivaled the grandeur of the original ship burial, each new find added to the growing picture of life in East Anglia during the early 7th century. The site itself was transformed into a place of historical importance. Sutton Hoo, once a quiet estate with little public attention, became a destination for visitors from around the world. People came to walk among the burial mounds, to imagine the grand ship that had once rested beneath the earth, and to learn about the Anglo-Saxon kings who had shaped England's early history. The National Trust, which took over the management of the site, worked to preserve the landscape and educate the public about the significance of the discovery. The Sutton Hoo ship burial also left a lasting mark on popular culture. The story of the excavation and the treasures it uncovered inspired books, documentaries, and films, all seeking to capture the drama and mystery of the find. The iconic image of the Sutton Hoo helmet, with its menacing faceplate and intricate designs, became a symbol of Anglo-Saxon England, appearing in countless depictions of early medieval warriors. The discovery continued to spark the imaginations of writers, artists, and filmmakers who were drawn to the idea of a long-lost king buried with his treasures, waiting to be rediscovered. Yet for all the attention Sutton Hoo received, the site remained, at its core, a place of deep historical and emotional significance. The ship burial was a reminder of the fragility of history, of how easily the past can be forgotten, buried beneath layers of earth, and how it can be uncovered only through persistence and curiosity. Basil Brown, the self-taught archaeologist who had first unearthed the ship, had never imagined the scope of what he would find. His dedication and careful work had revealed a treasure trove of history that might otherwise have remained hidden. In the decades following the excavation, Brown's role in the discovery was finally recognized. Though initially overshadowed by professional archaeologists who had later joined the dig, Brown's contributions were celebrated as those of a skilled and dedicated archaeologist. His careful methods and deep respect for the site had ensured that the treasures of Sutton Hoo were preserved for future generations. Today, he is remembered as the man who brought one of England's greatest archaeological discoveries to light. As the 21st century began, Sutton Hoo continued to capture the public's imagination. New technologies allowed archaeologists to explore the site in ways that had once been impossible, using ground-penetrating radar and other tools to search for hidden features beneath the earth. These advancements, while yielding fascinating insights, also underscored how much of the past still lay waiting to be discovered. The ship burial at Sutton Hoo was just one chapter in a much larger story, one that archaeologists and historians were still piecing together. For all the answers Sutton Hoo had provided, the site remained a place of wonder and speculation. Who had been buried there, and what had their life been like? What had driven their people to create such a magnificent burial? And what did it say about their beliefs, their values, and their place in the world? These questions, and many others, would likely remain unanswered, but that was part of the magic of Sutton Hoo. It was a place where history and mystery intertwined, where the past reached out to the present in ways both profound and elusive. The ship and its treasures had been buried for more than 1,000 years, hidden from the world, waiting for the right moment to be found. And now, as the story of Sutton Hoo continued to unfold, it was clear that the discovery had not only changed the way people understood the past, it had become part of the fabric of Britain's national identity, a reminder of the deep roots that connected the present to the distant, mysterious past. Anneliese Michel grew up in a small Bavarian village in post-war Germany, surrounded by the strong influence of the Catholic Church. From an early age, her life revolved around prayer, religious education, and a deep sense of devotion. Her parents, devout Catholics, believed that faith was the foundation of a moral life, and Anneliese embraced their teachings wholeheartedly. However, beneath the surface of this pious upbringing was a persistent pressure to achieve spiritual perfection, a burden she would carry throughout her short life. By the time she reached her teenage years, Anneliese felt an overwhelming sense of duty to live righteously. She avoided anything that might be considered sinful and constantly worried that her thoughts or actions might offend God. This need to be good was not just about faith. It became a source of intense anxiety. The line between religious devotion and fear of divine punishment grew thinner with each passing day. She confessed her sins frequently, sometimes obsessing over minor mistakes, such as missing a prayer or feeling envy toward a friend. To her, these slip-ups felt like betrayals, not just to God, but to herself. Her struggles with self-worth deepened when, at the age of 16, she experienced her first medical episode. During school, she suddenly lost control of her body, collapsing in a fit of convulsions. Confused and frightened, Annalise woke up in the hospital, where doctors diagnosed her with temporal lobe epilepsy, a neurological disorder known to cause seizures, memory lapses, and hallucinations. Although the doctors assured her that medication would manage her symptoms, Annalise sensed that her suffering had a deeper meaning. Why, she wondered, was she being afflicted this way? Had she somehow failed God? Despite taking prescribed anti-seizure medication, her symptoms persisted. Annalise began to experience terrifying visual disturbances, shadowy figures that would appear in her bedroom, whispering cruel words she couldn't ignore. Sometimes, these hallucinations made her question if the people around her were really there. These experiences were deeply unsettling, leaving her exhausted and anxious. She isolated herself, withdrawing from social activities, fearful of judgment and embarrassment. Her parents, initially hopeful that treatment would improve her condition, grew increasingly concerned. Her inner turmoil also led to unsettling behaviors. At first, she simply punished herself for perceived failings, praying for hours without rest, or kneeling on hard surfaces until her knees were bruised. However, as her mental state deteriorated, these behaviors grew more extreme. She would wake up in the middle of the night and intentionally sleep on the cold floor, believing it was a form of penance. Other times, she deprived herself of basic comforts, like food and warmth, convinced that she needed to suffer to purify her soul. As the seizures and hallucinations continued, Annalise's sense of identity became increasingly fragmented. She began questioning if she was cursed or if an evil presence had taken root within her. The medical explanations offered little comfort. How could something as clinical as a brain disorder account for the overwhelming darkness that haunted her mind? To Annalise, her suffering felt like a spiritual battle, a test from God that she had to endure, no matter the cost. As Annalise entered adulthood, her mental and physical state deteriorated rapidly. The seizures became more frequent, and no combination of medications seemed to control them. But what disturbed her most were the terrifying visions and voices that invaded her mind. These were not just hallucinations. She believed they carried a message, one that filled her with fear. At first, it was the faint sound of whispers, but soon they grew louder and more hostile. The voices accused her of being unworthy, insisting she was beyond redemption. They told her she had failed, that her soul was lost. The once devout girl, who had cherished her faith, began to experience deep confusion. Praying, which had once given her comfort, now seemed impossible. The voices mocked her when she tried, telling her that God no longer listened. She avoided church, even tearing up prayer cards and damaging crucifixes in frustration. It was as if everything sacred that had once anchored her life now felt distant and unreachable. Her behavior became increasingly erratic. In moments of panic, she would lash out, not knowing how to cope with the overpowering emotions inside her. She withdrew from her family, spending long hours alone in her room, unable to find peace. Sometimes she would pace back and forth or sit for hours in silence, lost in the storm of thoughts that never seemed to quiet. What frightened her most was the sense that she no longer had control over herself. Her family tried their best to help, but the changes in Annalise were overwhelming. She refused to eat regular meals, not because of a lack of hunger, but because she believed that depriving herself was the only way to cleanse her spirit. The voices told her that she did not deserve comfort or nourishment. She began to experience strange impulses, behaviors she couldn't explain but felt compelled to follow. She might suddenly throw herself to the ground, feeling as though her body was not her own to command. Night after night, Her sleep was interrupted by vivid nightmares of grotesque creatures and apocalyptic visions. Some nights she awoke in tears, convinced that her prayers had damned her instead of saved her. Other times she felt a compulsion to make herself physically uncomfortable, lying on the cold floor despite the warmth of her bed, or kneeling for hours until her legs trembled. These acts were not intended to harm, but felt like punishment she deserved. She hoped that, through suffering, she could find forgiveness for whatever unseen sin haunted her. The hallucinations worsened over time. Sometimes she saw figures she described as demons' twisted shapes with burning eyes lurking in the corners of her vision. She would scream and cry out to her parents, terrified by what she believed were real entities surrounding her. Her mother would try to comfort her, but nothing seemed to ease the fear. Even when the apparitions disappeared, their presence lingered in Annelise's mind. She believed these beings wanted to destroy her from within, and no amount of medical treatment could stop them. Doctors urged the family to remain patient, insisting that her symptoms were caused by her epilepsy and possibly a developing mental illness. Yet the Michel family was losing hope. Every new medication seemed to come with side effects that worsened Annelise's suffering, exhaustion, mood swings, and feelings of despair. They began to suspect that what tormented their daughter went beyond science's understanding. Meanwhile, Annelise herself grew more convinced that her affliction was not a medical problem, but a spiritual one. She told her parents that the medications were useless because she was not sick in the way the doctors thought. Something evil, she believed, had taken root inside her, and only faith could drive it out. She spoke of hearing names in her mind, figures she identified as Judas, Nero, and others condemned in Christian tradition. These presences taunted her, making her believe she was trapped in a battle for her soul. By the time Annelise's condition reached its breaking point, the Michel family had exhausted every medical option available to them. Each visit to a neurologist or psychiatrist ended with a prescription for new medications, anticonvulsants, antipsychotics, but nothing relieved Annelise's torment. As weeks turned into months, her parents began to believe that something far beyond medicine was plaguing their daughter. They were devout Catholics, and it became increasingly difficult for them to ignore the possibility that Annelise's suffering was spiritual, not merely medical. Annelise, too, had abandoned hope in medical explanations. She insisted that what controlled her wasn't a disease, but a dark force. Her strange behavior and outbursts now carried a sinister weight. She claimed that malevolent beings inhabited her, whispering blasphemies and urging her to reject everything good in her life. The voices were relentless, taunting her and telling her she was destined for ruin. At times, she felt she couldn't even pray because the words became twisted in her mouth, as if the darkness within her was interfering. Her family sought the advice of local priests, hoping that the church could offer the help that doctors could not. However, the priests were cautious. Official exorcisms were rare and required proof that the afflicted person's condition could not be explained by illness alone. The priests advised the Michels to continue with medical treatment, but Annelise's worsening state left them feeling helpless. Each passing day revealed new signs of her struggle. She would refuse meals for extended periods, explaining that it was part of a personal penance, or spend hours staring at religious objects, visibly distressed as if in conflict with herself. Despite these alarming signs, most of the clergy remained hesitant. However, Father Ernst Alt, a local priest, became deeply concerned about Annelise's condition. He believed her suffering was unlike anything he had encountered before. After meeting with Annelise, he noted the strange shifts in her personality moments where she seemed possessed by an overwhelming rage, only to collapse moments later, apologizing and sobbing uncontrollably. Father Alt, but these episodes were more than medical symptoms. He suspected that something spiritual was taking hold of her. The priest's belief was further cemented by Annelise's growing resistance to sacred items. On several occasions, She recoiled from crucifixes as if in pain and was unable to enter chapels, insisting that an unseen force was blocking her. Father Alt urged the family to pursue an exorcism, believing that it was the only way to save her. He explained that exorcisms were not quick fixes. They were difficult rituals that required time, endurance, and faith from everyone involved. But if her condition truly stemmed from a spiritual affliction, the ritual was their only option. To perform the rite, however, they needed formal permission from the diocese. Father Alt, along with another priest, Father Arnold Renz, documented Annelies's worsening symptoms and sent a request to Bishop Joseph Stangl. After reviewing the case, the bishop granted approval for the ritual Romanum, the official rite of exorcism. The priests were instructed to follow strict guidelines, ensuring the ritual was performed with care and precision. Anneliese welcomed the news of the exorcism. By this point, she was utterly convinced that she was being consumed by something evil, and she saw the ritual as her only hope for salvation. She told her parents that the demons inside her claimed they would never let her go, but she believed that through suffering, she could defeat them. Anneliese began to view her suffering not just as punishment, but as a form of sacrifice. She believed that her trials could help cleanse others, perhaps even atone for the sins of strangers she had never met. Her family was equally desperate for a solution, no matter how difficult it might be. They believed that the exorcism would be a path to healing, though none of them could have predicted the toll it would take. Anneliese's condition had already pushed them to the edge emotionally, spiritually, and physically. Yet, the promise of deliverance gave them a glimmer of hope that perhaps, at long last, their daughter could be freed from the torment that had consumed her life. But with that hope came fear. They knew the ritual would be grueling, and they worried about what it would do to Anneliese's fragile body. The priest warned them that the exorcism might provoke violent episodes and that there were no guarantees of success. But for the Michels, this was their final option. Medical treatments had failed, and time was slipping away. All they could do now was trust in the power of their faith and in Anneliese's belief that salvation was worth any price. In the fall of 1975, the first exorcism session began inside the Michel family's modest home. The room, dimly lit by candles and filled with religious artifacts, carried the quiet heaviness of fear and hope. Father Arnold Renz and Father Ernst Alt led the ceremony, reciting prayers from the ritual Romanum, the ancient text used to expel evil spirits. The atmosphere was tense, every word of the prayer heavy with expectation. Anneliese sat in the middle of the room, her hands trembling in her lap, waiting for the first confrontation with whatever force held her captive. From the very beginning, the sessions were harrowing. As the priest prayed over her, Anneliese's demeanor shifted rapidly. At times, she appeared peaceful, mouthing along with familiar prayers. But soon after, her voice would change, becoming low, hoarse, and full of malice. She would thrash violently in her chair, growling and shouting words she claimed weren't her own. It was as though multiple personalities had taken control, each one angry and defiant. She identified these voices as belonging to notorious figures like Judas and even darker beings, insisting that they lived within her and refused to leave. The exorcisms were physically and emotionally draining, not only for Anneliese, but for everyone involved. The priests and her parents often had to restrain her when she would throw herself onto the floor or bang her head against walls, driven by impulses she couldn't explain. Despite their efforts, Anneliese's physical condition began to deteriorate. Her body, already fragile from the months of self-denial, grew weaker with each passing session. She was unable to keep down food, convinced by the voices that she must reject earthly nourishment to complete her mission. The priest tried to encourage her to eat, but Anneliese refused, believing that her suffering was necessary for salvation. Each exorcism session lasted for hours, sometimes stretching late into the night. Her parents were horrified by what they witnessed. Annelise's voice shifting into guttural tones that didn't sound human, her body convulsing uncontrollably, and her skin breaking out in unexplained marks and bruises. Yet there were brief moments of lucidity, when she would beg her family to continue the ritual, insisting that she could feel the darkness being forced to the surface. Her parents clung to these moments, believing that Annelise's suffering was bringing her closer to freedom. They prayed alongside the priests, sometimes holding her hands as she trembled, and whispered that she could feel herself slipping away. To them, each session, no matter how excruciating, was a step closer to reclaiming their daughter from the grip of evil. Over the course of 10 months, more than 60 exorcism sessions were performed. Annelise's condition worsened with each one. She rarely slept, her nights filled with haunting visions that left her gasping for breath. During the day, she would pace the house or sit silently, lost in her thoughts, her once bright personality reduced to a shadow of its former self. As the rituals dragged on, the demons seemed to resist with greater intensity. Annelise would scream for hours, her voice cracking from exhaustion. She would mock the priests, taunting them with obscene language, daring them to continue. The priests remained resolute, believing that the intensity of her resistance was a sign that the exorcism was working. They prayed louder, reciting the sacred words over and over, hoping to wear down whatever force held her captive. The toll on Annelise's body was undeniable. She became severely underweight, her limbs weak and trembling from exhaustion. Her knees were swollen and bruised from hours spent kneeling in prayer, her voice hoarse from constant screaming. Yet she refused to stop. She believed that her suffering was part of a larger plan, that by enduring these trials, she was helping to save others from spiritual harm. To Annelise, this was no longer just about her freedom. It was a sacrifice for a higher purpose. Despite her family's pleas for rest, Annelise insisted on continuing the exorcisms. She begged her parents not to abandon the ritual, even though they could see her body was slowly giving out. Her mother often cried during the sessions, watching helplessly as her daughter endured what seemed like unbearable pain. But Annelise would always reassure her, saying that it would all be over soon, that she would be free, even if it meant surrendering everything she had left. The priests, too, struggled with the emotional weight of the situation. Father Renz and Father Out spent countless hours in prayer, asking for strength to continue. They knew that Annelise's condition was worsening, but they believed that abandoning the ritual would be tantamount to giving in to the forces they were fighting. The line between faith and desperation blurred, and the priests pressed forward, hoping that each session would finally bring the deliverance they sought. Toward the end of the exorcisms, Annelise's moments of clarity became fewer and far between. Her speech slowed, her movements were weak and uncoordinated, and her eyes, once bright with determination, grew distant. Yet she never expressed regret for what she had endured. In her rare, lucid moments, she whispered to her parents and the priests that she was ready for the end, whatever that might mean. By June 1976, Annelise Michel's body was ravaged from months of relentless exorcisms and physical exhaustion. Her frame was skeletal, her movements slow and unsteady. Yet, despite her weakened state, she clung to a fierce belief that the torment she endured had a higher purpose. Every breath she took felt like a battle, but Annelise was certain that she was on the verge of liberation, that through suffering, she could achieve a form of spiritual victory. Her parents were filled with both hope and dread. They wanted to believe that the end was near, that their daughter would finally be free from the torment that had consumed her for years. But they also saw the toll it had taken. Annelise could no longer walk without assistance, and speaking was a struggle. Still, whenever she had moments of lucidity, she insisted that the exorcisms continue. "I have to keep going," she whispered to her mother one night, her voice barely audible. "I'm almost there. The exorcism sessions became increasingly urgent as the priests and her family sensed that they were running out of time. During one of the final rituals, Annelise's body convulsed violently, her face twisted in pain. Yet, between these intense moments, she would sometimes flash a strange, serene smile, telling those around her that she could feel the darkness weakening. It was as if she believed that each moment of agony brought her closer to a divine release. On June 30th, 1976, the final exorcism session took place. Annelise was too weak to kneel, so she lay on a mattress placed on the floor. Her parents, desperate and exhausted, held her hands, hoping against hope that this would be the moment of deliverance. Father Renz and Father Alt recited the exorcism prayers with steady determination, their voices filling the room with sacred verses. Annelise's breathing was shallow, but she forced herself to respond to the prayers, whispering yes and please stay with me whenever she had the strength. Throughout the session, Annelise's expressions alternated between anguish and moments of strange peace. At one point, she looked into her mother's eyes and murmured, "Mother, I'm afraid." Her mother stroked her hair, fighting back tears, assuring Annelise that she was not alone. They all prayed that this would be the final battle, that the forces tormenting her would release their grip at last. Toward the end of the ritual, Annelise's voice softened, and she said something that haunted those present for years to come. "Please, don't give up on me." But as the hours dragged on, her strength gave out. The session ended without the sense of triumph they had hoped for, and Annelise, too weak to speak, closed her eyes and drifted into a restless sleep. The following morning, on July 1st, 1976, Annelise Michel passed away quietly in her home. Her parents discovered her lifeless body and, in their grief, called the priests to inform them of her passing. Annelise's frail frame, reduced to just over 60 pounds, was a tragic testament to the suffering she had endured. For her family and the priests, the overwhelming question was whether her death was a spiritual victory or an unbearable loss. The tragedy did not end with Annelise's passing. In the months that followed, the case drew public attention, leading to an investigation that scrutinized the actions of her parents and the priests. Authorities questioned whether Annelise's death could have been prevented had medical intervention been prioritized over religious rituals. Her parents and the priests were charged with negligent homicide, sparking a controversial trial that captivated the nation and raised difficult questions about the intersection of faith and mental health. During the trial, Annelise's parents defended their decision, insisting that they had followed their daughter's wishes and had acted out of love and desperation. They described Annelise as a willing participant in the exorcisms, someone who truly believed that her suffering had meaning. The priests, too, stood by their actions, explaining that they had exhausted every other option and that Annelise herself had pleaded for the rituals to continue. Medical experts testified that Annelise's condition was likely the result of untreated epilepsy and psychosis, worsened by the extreme stress of the exorcisms. But for those closest to Annelise, the answer was more complicated. They believed that Annelise's suffering could not be fully explained by medical terms, that something deeper had taken place, something beyond human understanding. In the end, the priests and Annelise's parents were found guilty of negligent homicide but received suspended sentences, as the court acknowledged that they had acted out of a misguided sense of care and faith. The verdict left many unresolved questions. Was Annelise a victim of untreated illness, or did she truly endure a spiritual trial? And if her suffering was real, did it accomplish the redemption she had hoped for? Annelise's story remains both a cautionary tale and a source of reflection on the complexities of faith, mental health, and the human need for meaning. To this day, some view her as a tragic figure who was failed by the systems meant to help her, while others believe that she experienced a spiritual battle that few can understand. In the years following her death, Her grave became a place of pilgrimage for those who believed in the possibility of miracles. Visitors left flowers, prayers, and messages, hoping that, in some way, Annelise's suffering had opened a path to healing. But for her family and the priests who had stood by her, the story was one of profound loss, a reminder that sometimes the search for salvation can lead to unimaginable sacrifice. In the dense, shadowy forests of the New Jersey Pine Barrens, the legend of the Jersey Devil was born. The year was 1735, and whispers of dark occurrences spread through the tight-knit, superstitious communities that called this untamed wilderness home. The origins of the tale began with a woman known as Mother Leeds, whose story was destined to be recounted and altered over generations, evolving into the chilling myth that persists to this day. Mother Leeds was no stranger to hardship. She lived in the remote Pine Barrens, where life was harsh and the land unforgiving. She and her husband, Daniel Leeds, struggled to support their large family. With 12 children already filling their modest home, the thought of yet another mouth to feed filled Mother Leeds with dread. Some versions of the story depict her as an exhausted and frustrated woman who could no longer bear the burden of raising such a large family under desperate circumstances. As the legend goes, Mother Leeds discovered she was pregnant with her 13th child and, in a moment of frustration, uttered words that would come to haunt her. "Let this one be a devil." It was not uncommon for people in that time to curse their misfortunes, but her words seemed to carry an ominous weight. Soon after, strange occurrences began to plague the Leeds household, as if the land itself were reacting to the spoken curse. The wind howled through the trees with an unsettling wail, and shadows seemed to linger longer than they should. Months passed, and as her pregnancy progressed, Mother Leeds was filled with a sense of dread she could not shake. On a stormy night, she went into labor, with the roar of thunder echoing through the forests and the wind rattling the walls of the modest cabin. She was attended by midwives, who came despite their own fears of venturing into the dark woods during such tempestuous weather. As they gathered around, the labor seemed to drag on far longer than usual, as if something unnatural was at work. When the child was finally born, it seemed at first to be a healthy, ordinary baby. Relief filled the room, and the midwives began their usual tasks. However, as moments passed, that relief quickly turned into terror. The newborn began to change before their eyes, its cries growing louder and more guttural. Its small body elongated, limbs stretching and contorting unnaturally. Thin, bat-like wings sprouted from its back, and coarse hair emerged along its skin. The creature's eyes glowed with a fiery intensity as its face twisted into a grotesque, animalistic form with a snout and jagged teeth. It was as though some dark force had possessed the child, transforming it into a creature that defied all understanding. Panic gripped the midwives, who recoiled in horror as the creature let out an inhuman shriek and took flight, bursting through the cabin's roof and disappearing into the night. The legend claims it escaped into the depths of the Pine Barrens, leaving a trail of shattered timber and broken shingles behind. As the howling winds faded, the house fell silent, except for the terrified cries of Mother Leeds, whose life had been forever altered by that cursed night. In the days that followed, stories about the events in the Leeds household spread quickly through the local villages. Some whispered that the baby was indeed born with a curse, while others believed that Mother Leeds had dabbled in dark practices, invoking powers beyond her control. There were those who said she had made a pact with forces unseen, an unholy bargain for a reason that remained a mystery. Rumors also circulated that the Leeds family was associated with other forms of local superstition and dissent, adding fuel to the fire. As the tale spread, the child's transformation into the Jersey Devil became more elaborate, with each retelling layering new details onto the existing lore. The local religious community viewed this story as a warning against sinful behavior and moral decay. They saw the events as divine retribution for what they believed was Mother Leeds' blasphemous curse. The Pine Barrens, with its vast, dark forests and twisting trails, became a breeding ground for superstition. People whispered that the woods themselves had a life of their own, and that Mother Leeds' cursed child roamed them as a creature of vengeance or punishment. Farmers and travelers claimed to hear strange cries at night, and there were occasional reports of livestock disappearing or being found with bizarre injuries. The Leeds family name, once associated with the influential and sometimes controversial almanac writer Daniel Leeds, grew darker with each passing year as the story of the Jersey Devil became intertwined with the family's own complicated history. Daniel Leeds himself was no stranger to controversy. His writings had been condemned as heretical by some religious leaders, leading to suspicions that his family had fallen under some kind of supernatural influence. Thus, the tale of the Jersey Devil was not merely a ghost story, but also a reflection of the fears and conflicts of the time. The story would continue to evolve, becoming a part of local folklore and an emblem of the mysterious Pine Barrens. With each generation, new elements were added. The creature was said to have cloven hooves, a serpent-like tail, and the ability to breathe fire. Some stories suggested it could vanish into thin air, or that it appeared as a foreboding omen before disasters. The legend became ingrained in the culture of New Jersey, passed down from parents to children as a cautionary tale. In this way, the Jersey Devil became more than just a myth. It was a symbol of the dark unknown, the fears that lurked on the edges of society, and the potential consequences of words spoken in anger. As time went on, the details of its origins were debated, but the essence of the story persisted. A child, cursed from birth, transformed into a creature that roamed the Pine Barrens, leaving behind a legacy that would be told and retold for centuries. Mother Leeds' tale was just the beginning. What had started as a night of terror in a small, rural cabin would grow into one of America's most enduring legends, forever haunting the dark woods of New Jersey. The legend of the Jersey Devil, rooted in the terrifying events surrounding Mother Leeds, began to spread far beyond the Leeds household, becoming a tale that seeped into the very fabric of life in southern New Jersey. In the 18th and 19th centuries, sightings of a strange creature in the Pine Barrens grew in frequency, captivating the imaginations and fears of the people living in the area. These early reports varied widely, but they all carried one consistent theme. There was something unnatural dwelling in the dense, dark woods. The Pine Barrens itself, a sprawling forest of nearly 1 million acres, was an environment that seemed tailor-made for legends. It was a place of winding trails, boggy marshes, and trees so thick that sunlight struggled to penetrate. The forest had long been viewed with suspicion by settlers, who saw it as a wild, untamed land. Even the Native American tribes, such as the Lenape, spoke of spirits in the woods, though their lore did not describe anything quite like the Jersey Devil. The stories that emerged in the wake of Mother Leeds' fateful night added a new layer of dread to a place already shrouded in mystery. The first recorded sightings of the creature began to appear not long after the legend's origin. These early accounts spoke of a flying beast with wings and a hideous, animal-like face. Witnesses often described seeing the creature during moonless nights, when the sky was black and the only sound was the rustling of leaves in the breeze. Farmers reported strange tracks near their properties, hoofprints unlike those of any known animal, and some claimed to have lost livestock under mysterious circumstances. Their remains discovered with peculiar marks and no signs of a struggle. The sightings were not limited to rural farms. They occurred near towns as well. People spoke of encountering the creature along lonely roads, its figure emerging from the darkness to spread its wings and take flight, disappearing into the night sky with a bone-chilling screech. The descriptions varied in detail, but shared enough similarities to keep the legend alive. Some spoke of the creature as being the size of a large dog, while others insisted it was much larger, with a wingspan that stretched 10 feet or more. Its face, they said, was ghastly, a twisted mix of horse-like features and something else, something more sinister. As these accounts circulated, the Jersey Devil became a symbol of the unknown dangers lurking in the Pine Barrens. The early settlers, already living in a land that felt wild and unpredictable, found a new reason to fear the woods at night. It wasn't long before the Jersey Devil began to take on a near-mythical status, with sightings spreading beyond the immediate area and becoming known in neighboring states like Pennsylvania and Delaware. Each new report seemed to add to the creature's lore, with the details morphing and expanding as the story spread from mouth to mouth. The local communities, largely isolated and deeply rooted in superstition, embraced the tale with a mix of fear and fascination. The Jersey Devil was not just a tale of a monstrous beast. It was a reflection of the people's anxieties, a manifestation of their unease with the harsh wilderness and the difficult lives they led. The creature came to represent the unpredictability of nature, a symbol of the forces that lay just beyond human understanding. Religious leaders sometimes used the legend to illustrate sermons, presenting the Jersey Devil as a sign of the devil's work or as a warning against moral decay. The narrative of the creature's origins, involving a cursed child and a mother's desperate words, played into the idea of divine punishment, a notion that resonated in the deeply religious communities of the time. As stories continued to circulate, some were written down, further cementing the Jersey Devil's place in folklore. Newspaper articles from as early as the late 18th century referenced the creature, although these accounts often carried a tone of skepticism, treating the sightings as curious local tales rather than serious events. Still, enough people reported seeing the creature or claimed to know someone who had that the legend persisted. In fact, the mystery surrounding the Jersey Devil seemed only to deepen with each new account. The Pine Barrens' reputation grew darker, and the people living near its borders took additional precautions, especially at night. Among the most unsettling reports were those from hunters and woodsmen, people who spent much of their time in the forests and were familiar with the local wildlife. These men spoke of encountering something that defied explanation, a beast whose movements were unnatural and whose presence sent chills down their spines. Some told of hearing strange cries echoing through the trees, a sound that could not be attributed to any known animal. A few claimed to have glimpsed the creature up close, its glowing eyes piercing the darkness before it vanished, leaving them shaken and bewildered. The legend began to attract more attention from those outside the region, including skeptics and scholars. While some dismissed the stories as mere superstition or the exaggerations of frightened minds, others were intrigued by the consistency in the descriptions. Cryptozoologists, though not yet a recognized field at the time, would have considered the accounts with great interest, noting how folklore could sometimes hint at unknown species or animals not yet classified by science. It was suggested that the Jersey Devil might be a misidentified species, an animal unknown to the scientific community, or even a creature brought over from another continent during the age of exploration. However, for the locals who lived near the Pine Barrens, the Jersey Devil was not simply a curiosity, it was a very real part of their lives. They took its presence seriously, sometimes avoiding certain areas at night and sharing stories of encounters to warn others. Families passed down tales of the creature from generation to generation, each new version adding details or altering the story slightly, but always keeping the core of the legend alive. Children grew up hearing bedtime stories of the beast that roamed the woods, and young men dared each other to go deep into the forest to see if they could catch a glimpse of the infamous Jersey Devil. The early sightings of the Jersey Devil did more than just entertain or frighten. They helped shape the identity of the Pine Barrens and the people who lived there. The legend offered a sense of continuity in a world that was rapidly changing, with new settlers arriving and industrialization slowly encroaching on the once untamed wilderness. In some ways, the Jersey Devil served as a guardian of the old ways, a reminder that despite humanity's attempts to tame the world, there would always be mysteries beyond our control. It was a story that belonged to the land itself, a legend that grew from the soil of the Pine Barrens and took root in the hearts and minds of those who called it home. As more people came to believe in the Jersey Devil, sightings continued to be reported, often with a sense of dread and wonder. The stories became a fundamental part of the region's folklore, blending the line between myth and reality. What had started as a rural legend was now something more, a shared cultural experience that unified the communities of southern New Jersey, giving them a tale as old and deep as the woods themselves. The legend of the Jersey Devil might have lingered on the fringes of folklore for centuries, but in January 1909, it exploded into the national consciousness. The events of that week, often referred to as the Week of Terror, would solidify the Jersey Devil's reputation as more than just a rural ghost story. It became a phenomenon that captivated newspapers, terrified communities, and left many wondering whether the Pine Barrens really hid something monstrous in its depths. It all began on a cold winter night when a report surfaced from Bristol, Pennsylvania, just across the Delaware River from New Jersey. A man named James Sackville described hearing an unusual noise outside his window, something between a high-pitched scream and a growl. When he looked out into the darkness, he caught a glimpse of a creature like nothing he had ever seen before. A large, winged beast with glowing eyes and a horse-like face. Sackville's report quickly spread, and soon others were coming forward with similar stories. Some described seeing strange tracks in the snow hoof-like prints with an inexplicable stride, indicating that whatever made them had either jumped an impossible distance or taken flight. Within days, reports were coming in from various towns across New Jersey, Philadelphia, and even as far away as Delaware. The newspapers picked up the stories, and sensational headlines screamed about the Jersey Devil's return. Eyewitness accounts described the creature swooping down from rooftops, darting through backyards, and even scratching at doors and windows. People reported livestock disappearing, dogs barking furiously at nothing, and unsettling noises in the dead of night. It seemed as though the entire region was in the grip of some unseen force, and no one felt safe. One of the most widely circulated accounts came from the towns of Haddonfield and Killingswood, New Jersey, where groups of people claimed to have seen the creature firsthand. In Killingswood, it was said to have attacked a trolley car, terrorizing the passengers before vanishing into the night. Witnesses described it as having leathery wings and a long tail, its eyes burning red as it screeched and flapped away. In Haddonfield, a local pastor reportedly saw it perched on the roof of his church, a dark silhouette against the night sky. Though he attempted to get closer, the creature flew off before he could confirm what he had seen. The panic reached its peak when schools closed due to widespread fears, and workers stayed home rather than risk encountering the mysterious beast. The New Jersey police and the local fire departments were flooded with calls. Armed search parties were organized to venture into the Pine Barrens, equipped with rifles and torches. Despite their best efforts, none could find any definitive trace of the Jersey Devil. No lair, no nests, and no captured beast. The only signs of its passage were the peculiar tracks that continued to appear in fields and on rooftops, and occasional, spine-chilling cries that echoed through the night. The 1909 panic also saw a rise in reported close encounters that stretched credulity. For example, one story told of a local woman who claimed to have fended off the creature with a broomstick after it supposedly landed on her roof. Another account came from Camden, New Jersey, where it was said that a police officer fired his revolver at the creature without causing it any harm. In these stories, the Jersey Devil seemed almost supernatural, as if it could not be harmed or captured, a being that defied not only nature, but also the laws of physics. As the panic gripped the region, explanations for the sightings varied wildly. Some people theorized that the creature was a kind of prehistoric animal that had somehow survived extinction. Others suggested it was a mutant born from the swamps of the Pine Barrens, where harsh conditions and isolation might have bred some unknown species. A few more imaginative individuals even suggested it was the vengeful spirit of a long-forgotten Native American shaman, wandering the woods in search of those who had wronged his people. However, the most popular explanation continued to be the traditional folklore surrounding Mother Leeds and her cursed 13th child, who had been transformed into the monstrous Jersey Devil. Skeptics, however, were not so quick to believe. While some of the more sensationalist newspapers ran wild with the stories, others attempted to provide rational explanations for the strange events. They speculated that the sightings were the result of mass hysteria, a kind of collective panic that spread from person to person, inflaming imaginations and leading to exaggerated claims. Some believed that known animals, such as owls or large birds, were being misidentified in the dark, their natural behaviors mistaken for something far more sinister. The peculiar tracks, they suggested, could have been the work of pranksters looking to capitalize on the frenzy. Still, for every skeptic's voice, there seemed to be 2 or 3 believers, each with their own story or testimony. Many of these accounts came from individuals who had no previous interest in the legend and no reason to fabricate such tales. The consistency in descriptions, wings, hoof feet, glowing eyes, and a horse-like face was difficult to dismiss entirely. Even the most level-headed members of the community were left with a lingering doubt, a fear that perhaps there was some truth to the ancient story that had haunted New Jersey for so long. The events of 1909 left a lasting impact on the region. Though no solid evidence was ever found to confirm the existence of the Jersey Devil, the legend was more alive than ever. It had made the leap from local folklore to national attention, capturing the imaginations of people far beyond the Pine Barrens. The panic also left behind a legacy of bizarre folklore and unexplained events. For years afterward, occasional sightings continued to trickle in, often dismissed by authorities, but never completely forgotten by the people. The story of the 1909 Jersey Devil panic has been revisited by historians, folklorists, and cryptozoologists alike. Some researchers have suggested that the surge in sightings could be tied to the socio-political climate of the time, with economic uncertainty and societal changes contributing to the spread of fear. Others have noted that the mass sightings corresponded with a time of significant cultural interest in the supernatural and the unusual, a period when ghost stories, seance practices, and interest in the paranormal were particularly popular in American society. In retrospect, the 1909 panic serves as a fascinating case study in the power of folklore and mass psychology. It demonstrates how stories can take on a life of their own, fueled by fear and imagination. Even without tangible proof, the legend of the Jersey Devil persisted, each retelling a new report adding to the mystery. The events of that fateful January were not just a momentary spectacle. They were a defining chapter in the ongoing tale of the Jersey Devil, forever cementing its place in American folklore. Though the mass hysteria eventually subsided, the question remained: what did people really see? Was there truly a creature lurking in the Pine Barrens, or had the legend simply grown so strong that it could compel people to see what was not there? The answers may never be known, but one thing was certain: the Jersey Devil had become more than just a local legend. It had emerged from the shadows to claim its place in the American imagination, a story that, for one chaotic week in 1909, seemed all too real. After the infamous events of 1909, the legend of the Jersey Devil didn't fade away. It evolved, adapting to changing times and finding a place in the hearts and minds of new generations. Throughout the 20th and 21st centuries, sightings and encounters continued, adding fresh layers to the lore and keeping the mystery alive. Each account shared enough elements with the original tales to maintain continuity, but the details varied as the Jersey Devil took on new forms in the public's imagination. The Pine Barrens, with its eerie landscapes and isolated expanses, remained a fitting backdrop for modern encounters. In the years following the 1909 panic, the region saw periods of renewed interest whenever a fresh sighting was reported. Some witnesses claimed to have seen the creature flying over the treetops, its dark wings silhouetted against the sky, while others spoke of hearing unsettling sounds that seemed to come from deep within the forest. These accounts often came from locals, hunters, hikers, or drivers who found themselves in the more remote areas. The Pine Barrens, despite its occasional bursts of tourism, retained a sense of foreboding that seemed to invite such stories. One well-known sighting occurred in 1937, when a taxi driver in Salem City reported an encounter with the Jersey Devil. While driving late at night along a rural road, he described seeing a winged creature dart out in front of his vehicle. According to the driver, the beast's eyes glowed in his headlights, and it let out a high-pitched screech before disappearing into the darkness. His account gained some local attention, with skeptics suggesting he had mistaken an owl or large bat for something more sinister. Still, those who were familiar with the legend found his story compelling, as the description matched the creature's classic features: wings, glowing eyes, and an unnatural cry. Throughout the 1950s and 1960s, the Jersey Devil once again captured public interest. During this era, America's fascination with the strange and unexplained reached new heights, fueled by a cultural interest in UFOs, cryptids, and supernatural phenomena. The Pine Barrens, with its long-standing association with the unknown, became a focus for those interested in such mysteries. Reports emerged of the creature being seen near campgrounds, darting across highways, and even peering into cabin windows late at night. Some visitors to the region claimed to have found odd tracks or heard chilling cries echoing through the forest. The most notable incident of the modern era took place in 1972, when an off-duty police officer in the town of Atco claimed to have come face-to-face with the Jersey Devil. According to the officer, he was driving home late one evening when he saw a creature standing on the side of the road. Its appearance was otherworldly, a horse-like face with glowing red eyes, leathery wings, and a long tail. As he slowed down, the creature suddenly leaped across the road in a single bound, disappearing into the thick forest on the other side. The officer's story was widely circulated, and while it attracted a fair share of skepticism, his reputation as a credible witness added a degree of legitimacy to the account. In the decades that followed, reports of the Jersey Devil became intertwined with local culture, appearing in everything from tourist attractions to sports teams' mascots. The New Jersey hockey team, the Jersey Devils, adopted the creature's name in 1982, cementing the legend as a proud, albeit spooky, part of the state's identity. The story continued to serve as a symbol of the Pine Barrens' mystery and allure, often used as a promotional tool to attract visitors to the area. Festivals, haunted tours, and themed events kept the legend alive, drawing in enthusiasts who were eager to explore the history behind the myth and perhaps even catch a glimpse of the infamous creature themselves. Despite the commercialization of the Jersey Devil, genuine sightings continued to be reported. In 1993, a park ranger in the Wharton State Forest, one of the largest protected areas of the Pine Barrens, claimed to have heard an unnatural wailing sound late at night. The ranger, who was patrolling the forest's more remote trails, said the noise was unlike anything he had ever encountered, even in an area known for its diverse wildlife. The sound, he described, was half scream, half growl, and seemed to come from a place deeper in the woods. Although he never saw the creature that night, the experience left him uneasy, and he made sure to include it in his report. In the 21st century, as technology advanced, Sightings of the Jersey Devil began to shift into the realm of social media and digital forums. People shared stories, photos, and videos, claiming to have seen strange creatures in the woods or captured mysterious sounds on audio recordings. While many of these modern accounts were met with skepticism, often dismissed as hoaxes or cases of mistaken identity, the persistent nature of the reports suggested that the legend still had a powerful hold on the public's imagination. Skeptics pointed to the influence of media, the availability of digital editing tools, and the desire for attention as reasons for the increase in reports. However, for some, the similarities between older accounts and new stories raised questions about whether there was still an element of truth behind the legend. The Jersey Devil's role in popular culture has also evolved, appearing in films, television shows, and books. It has been portrayed as everything from a menacing monster to a misunderstood creature struggling for survival in a world that encroaches on its territory. Each depiction adds another layer to the legend, blurring the lines between fact, fiction, and folklore. While some versions stick closely to the traditional accounts of a cursed creature from colonial times, others take creative liberties, reimagining the Jersey Devil as a guardian of the Pine Barrens or a symbol of environmental preservation. These modern interpretations reflect changing attitudes toward nature and the unknown, demonstrating how folklore can adapt to contemporary themes. The Pine Barrens itself, despite becoming more accessible over the years, retains an air of mystery that fuels the legend. Even today, much of the area remains wild and uninhabited, with miles of dense forests, wetlands, and abandoned towns. For those who venture into its depths, the feeling of isolation can be overwhelming, as if stepping back in time to an era when the land was truly untamed. It is easy to see how stories of strange creatures could persist in a place where reality and myth seem to coexist. For many, the Pine Barrens is not just a physical location, but a place where the boundaries between the known and the unknown blur, allowing legends like the Jersey Devil to endure. As new sightings continue to be reported, it remains unclear whether they are simply the product of overactive imaginations, deliberate fabrications, or genuine encounters with something unexplainable. Some researchers continue to investigate the phenomenon, exploring whether the Jersey Devil could be linked to undiscovered species, rare animal mutations, or even psychological effects of the Pine Barrens' unique environment. Others remain convinced that the legend is a cultural artifact, a story that has persisted because it speaks to deeper human fears and the allure of the mysterious. Regardless of its origins, the Jersey Devil remains an iconic part of New Jersey's folklore. It is a reminder that even in an age dominated by science and technology, there are still places where the unexplained can thrive, where stories can become more than just tales told around a campfire. The legend of the Jersey Devil is not merely about a creature lurking in the woods. It is about the enduring power of folklore, the mystery of the Pine Barrens, and the way stories can shape the world around us. As the legend moves further into the digital age, its ability to adapt and endure suggests that the Jersey Devil will continue to haunt the Pine Barrens and the imaginations of those who hear its tale. It is a story that refuses to die, a legend that lives on in the shadowy depths of New Jersey's forests, where even the skeptics may find themselves glancing over their shoulders, just in case. As the legend of the Jersey Devil evolved over the centuries, it became more than just a tale of a creature stalking the Pine Barrens. It emerged as a cultural touchstone that reflected the fears, hopes, and mystery of the region. While modern sightings and stories have added new dimensions to the folklore, the pursuit of truth behind the legend continues. Whether through scholarly research, amateur investigations, or creative reimaginings, the Jersey Devil endures as a powerful symbol of the unknown. In recent decades, various researchers and folklorists have revisited the Jersey Devil legend, seeking to separate fact from fiction. Some have taken an academic approach, exploring the story's historical and cultural origins. They have traced the tale back to colonial times, examining the context in which the legend first emerged. In a time when superstition and religious beliefs heavily influenced daily life, the birth of a devil in a remote area could have served as a cautionary tale about curses or the consequences of going against social norms. Scholars have noted how the Jersey Devil legend may have originated from fears surrounding the natural world, unexplained phenomena, or even as an early form of propaganda to discredit local families or rival settlements. One theory suggests that the original Jersey Devil story was a form of political satire. According to this interpretation, the Leeds family, who were associated with the legend, had a history of conflict with prominent figures in early colonial America. Daniel Leeds, a member of the family, was a well-known Quaker turned Anglican who published almanacs that included astrological symbols and other content considered controversial by the Quaker community. His son, Titan Leeds, later continued the family's publishing business and had a famous feud with Benjamin Franklin, who humorously predicted Titan's death in his own almanac. Some folklorists have proposed that the Leeds family was transformed into the infamous Leeds Devil as a way to mock them or cast aspersions on their character, especially given the family's outsider status in the Quaker-dominated region. As historical research sheds light on the legend's origins, other investigators have focused on the possibility of a real creature behind the sightings. Some cryptozoologists, a group of researchers dedicated to studying unknown animals, have suggested that reports of the Jersey Devil could stem from sightings of an undiscovered species native to the Pine Barrens. They argue that the creature's described features, such as its wings, unusual cries, and peculiar tracks, could be attributed to a large bird or a species of bat not yet documented by science. While the likelihood of such a discovery remains slim, the Pine Barrens' unique environment, with its dense forests and isolated areas, continues to fuel speculation about the existence of hidden wildlife. Another scientific approach has considered the psychological and sociological factors that may explain the persistence of the Jersey Devil legend. Researchers have pointed to the role of mass hysteria, particularly during times of economic or social stress, as a possible explanation for clusters of sightings. For instance, the 1909 panic occurred during a period of industrialization and economic uncertainty in the region, which may have heightened people's fears and made them more susceptible to believing in supernatural occurrences. The human brain's tendency to seek patterns and explanations for the unexplainable could have played a role in turning ordinary events or animal encounters into seemingly paranormal experiences. In addition to academic and scientific efforts, the Jersey Devil has attracted a devoted community of enthusiasts who continue to search for evidence of its existence. Equipped with modern technology, these amateur investigators venture into the Pine Barrens armed with night vision cameras, audio recording equipment, and drones. They document unexplained sounds, strange tracks, and occasionally claim to have captured brief glimpses of shadowy figures. While these investigations have yet to yield definitive proof, the thrill of the hunt and the possibility of uncovering the truth keep the legend alive. The Pine Barrens itself, with its rugged terrain and haunting atmosphere, only adds to the allure of these expeditions. The Jersey Devil has also left a significant impact on local culture, influencing the way people perceive the Pine Barrens and even New Jersey itself. The legend has become a symbol of state pride, embodying the resilience and mystery of a place often overshadowed by its urban reputation. The story has been incorporated into school curriculums, local festivals, and even marketing campaigns, all of which celebrate the state's unique folklore. Many residents see the legend as a reminder of New Jersey's diverse heritage, where history, nature, and myth intersect. Tourism related to the Jersey Devil has grown in popularity, with guided tours, themed attractions, and merchandise contributing to a local industry centered on the legend. The Pine Barrens has become a destination for ghost hunters, nature enthusiasts, and those simply curious about the mysterious creature. However, the commercialization of the legend has led some to question whether the true essence of the folklore is being lost in the pursuit of profit. While the stories continue to attract visitors, some traditionalists worry that the deeper meaning behind the legend, its roots in local history, and the interplay between humanity and nature may be overshadowed by sensationalism. The role of the Jersey Devil in media has further complicated its legacy. The creature has appeared in various forms of entertainment, from horror movies and TV shows to comic books and video games. Each portrayal adds a new twist to the story, sometimes transforming the Jersey Devil from a frightening monster into a misunderstood anti-hero or even a victim of circumstance. These creative retellings highlight the legend's adaptability, demonstrating how folklore can evolve to suit contemporary audiences. At the same time, they can blur the line between the original story and modern interpretations, making it difficult to distinguish fact from fiction. For those who live near or frequently visit the Pine Barrens, the Jersey Devil remains an ever-present element of the local landscape. Even among skeptics, the legend is acknowledged with a sense of respect, if only for its place in the region's history. Residents sometimes share stories passed down through generations, often in a tone that mixes humor with an underlying hint of unease. While many don't truly believe in the existence of the Jersey Devil, there's still a quiet recognition that the Pine Barrens can be an eerie place, especially at night. The dense forest, the remote trails, and the sounds of unseen wildlife create an atmosphere where the legend feels almost plausible. As the Jersey Devil legend continues to grow, it serves as a testament to the enduring power of storytelling. The creature's tale has outlasted generations, evolving with each new account while remaining rooted in the core elements that first made it compelling. The Jersey Devil is a reminder of the human fascination with the unknown, a symbol of the mysteries that still exist in a world often thought to be fully explored. It shows how folklore can capture the collective imagination, inspiring both fear and wonder. The search for the Jersey Devil is not merely about finding a physical creature. It's about exploring the human desire to uncover the unexplained, to connect with the past, and to find meaning in the natural world. Whether the Jersey Devil is real or a product of folklore may ultimately be less important than the legend's impact on the culture and identity of New Jersey. As long as there are stories to tell and mysteries to ponder, the Jersey Devil will remain a vital part of the state's folklore, casting its shadow over the Pine Barrens and inviting future generations to delve into its story. The legend, whether approached with belief or skepticism, teaches that some mysteries may never be fully solved, and that's where their magic lies. The Jersey Devil's tale has transcended its origins, becoming a legend that continues to fascinate, challenge, and inspire. Even as the world changes, the Pine Barrens will always be a place where one can hear whispers of something beyond understanding, where the Jersey Devil still roams in the imaginations of all who dare to wonder what might be lurking just out of sight.